Before we begin, if you enjoy tales of the past that are equal parts grim and oddly comforting, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more boring bedtime stories. Tonight's chapter is a slow, meandering stroll through the life of a medieval peasant before everything went terribly, irreversibly wrong. Chapter 1. A day in the life before the plague. The rooster didn't crow so much as it screamed, a ragged, indignant sound that tore through the damp morning air like a rusty saw through rotted wood. It was the kind of noise that made you question whether the bird was announcing the dawn or just expressing its profound dissatisfaction with existence. Either way, it was time to get up. Eustace, a peasant of no remarkable distinction, peeled his face from the straw-filled sack he called a pillow. His back ached because of course it did. Sleeping on a mattress stuffed with whatever scraps hadn't been eaten by mice tended to have that effect. Beside him, his wife Joan groaned and rolled over, her breath warm and sour. Neither of them had slept well. The baby had been up half the night teething. The fire had smoldered out by midnight, and the dog, a perpetually nervous creature named Drool, had spent the hours between moonset and dawn scratching fleas with the diligence of a monk copying scripture. Eustace stretched, which was less a motion of rejuvenation and more a series of audible pops along his spine. The floor beneath his bare feet was cold and uneven, packed earth worn smooth by generations of shuffling feet. He reached for his tunic, a garment that had started its life as a shade of brownish green, but had since faded into something that could only be described as the color of disappointment. It smelled faintly of sweat, damp wool, and the ghost of last week's onion soup. Outside, the village of Lower Pidlington was stirring. The sky was the dull gray of unwashed linen, promising another day of drizzle and mud. The kind of weather that made you wonder if the sun had ever truly existed, or if it was just a story told to children to keep them from despairing entirely. Breakfast was a solemn affair. A hunk of coarse bread, slightly stale, and a cup of small beer. The weak, watery brew that even children drank because the water alone was likely to kill you. Joan handed him the bread without a word. They had been married 7 years. Long enough that most of their conversations now consisted of grunts, sighs, and the occasional meaningful glance that could convey anything from "I am tired-y" to "If you don't fix that leaking roof soon, I swear to God I will set the house on fire with both of us inside." Then the fields awaited. Eustace stepped out into the mist, his breath curling in the damp air. The village was a cluster of wattle and daub huts, their thatched roofs sagging like the brows of men who had seen too much. A few chickens pecked at the dirt, their movements jerky and suspicious, as if they were convinced the ground might betray them at any moment. The Lord's demesne stretched out beyond the village, a patchwork of strips worked by Eustace and his neighbors. The soil was stubborn, yielding just enough to keep them all on the knife's edge of survival. Today's task was weeding, a chore so mind-numbing that it bordered on philosophical. Bent at the waist, Eustace worked his way down the rows, plucking out the unwanted green invaders with fingers already stiff from the morning chill. The rhythm was almost meditative. Bend, pluck, toss, repeat. Bend, pluck, toss, repeat. Around him the other peasants toiled in silence. There was Walter, whose nose had been broken so many times it now sat sideways on his face like a drunkard sleeping in a ditch. There was Agnes, who could outwork men twice her size and had the shoulders to prove it. And there was young Tom, who still had the energy to whistle tunelessly as he worked, a habit that annoyed everyone but which no one had the heart to discourage because, well, someone ought to find joy in this life. By midday, Eustace's back felt like it had been used as an anvil. His hands were dirty, his knees were protesting, and his stomach was growling like an angry badger. Lunch was a brief respite. More bread, a bit of cheese that was harder than virtue, and a handful of last autumn's wrinkled apples. He ate sitting on a tree stump, watching a lone crow pick at something in the dirt. The bird paused, cocked its head, and gave him a look that suggested it knew something he didn't. The afternoon brought more weeding, Then the endless task of repairing a fence that seemed to exist solely to test the patience of mortals. The wood was rotting, the nails were rusted, and every time Eustace thought he'd fixed one section, another would sag like a drunkard against a tavern wall. At one point, he hit his thumb with the hammer and suppressed the urge to scream. Instead, he sucked on the injury and contemplated the vast, indifferent universe. As the light began to fade, the village gathered for the evening's entertainment, watching old Simon attempt to teach his pig to dance. The pig, a creature of considerable girth and limited enthusiasm, responded to Simon's coaxing by sitting down firmly in the mud and staring at the crowd as if to say, "You're all fools, and I refuse to participate in this farce." The villagers laughed anyway, because what else was there to do? Supper was a thin pottage of peas, onions, and whatever scraps of meat had been scraped together. It was hot, which was the best that could be said of it. Afterward, Eustace sat by the fire, Joan mending a tunic beside him, the baby finally asleep in its cradle. Droll the dog sprawled across his feet, twitching in some canine dream. The night was quiet, save for the occasional cough from a neighbor's hut or the distant hoot of an owl. Tomorrow would be the same, rising with the angry rooster, working the unyielding earth, eating the meager food, and falling into bed exhausted. It was a hard life, but it was theirs, and for now at least they were alive. Chapter 2. The first whispers of death. The peddler arrived on a Thursday, though days of the week meant little in Lower Pidlington. What mattered was whether it was a feast day, a market day, or just another day of backbreaking labor. Still, there was something about the peddler that made the villagers pause, if only because he was the first outsider to visit since the harvest festival. And outsiders always brought news, some of it useful, most of it nonsense, and all of it a temporary distraction from the endless cycle of sowing and reaping. He was a wiry man with a face like a half-chewed apple, his clothes patched in places that suggested he'd been in a fight with a thorn bush and lost. His cart, a rickety contraption held together by faith and fraying rope, carried the usual assortment of trinkets, needles that bent at the slightest pressure, ribbons that had long since lost their color, and a small barrel of salted fish that smelled faintly of regret. Eustace watched from the edge of the village green as the peddler set up his wares, Joan beside him with the baby, balanced on her hip. The peddler had a way of talking that made even the most mundane items sound like treasures from the Holy Land, a skill that was either admirable or deeply suspicious depending on who you asked. "Fine ribbons for the ladies," the peddler announced, holding up a strip of fabric that might have been blue once. "Woven by the nimble fingers of Flemish maidens, or so I'm told. Could have been a one-handed drunkard in Calais, but who's to say?" A few of the village women chuckled, though none stepped forward to buy. Money was scarce, and no one was fool enough to part with it for something as frivolous as a ribbon, no matter how many Flemish maidens were involved. Then the peddler lowered his voice, leaning in, as if sharing a secret. "But that's not why I'm here, friends. No, I bring word from the east, strange tidings, dark tidings." Eustace felt Joan tense beside him. Dark tidings were never good, but they were usually more interesting than weeding. "What kind of tidings?" Walter called out, his voice rough from years of shouting at sheep. The peddler glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers, though the only audience was a handful of peasants and a goat that had wandered over to investigate. "Plague," he said, the word landing like a stone in mud. "They say it's spreading through the ports. Ships full of dead men drifting into harbor, towns where the living can't bury the dead fast enough, bodies stacked like firewood." A murmur ran through the crowd. Agnes crossed herself, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Young Tom, who had been picking at a loose thread on his tunic, looked up sharply, his eyes wide. "Where?" Joan asked, her voice steady but tight. The peddler shrugged. "East, south, everywhere, if the stories are true. They say it starts with a fever, then the swellings, black as sin, hard as stone. After that, Well, well, he trailed off, letting the silence speak for itself. Eustace frowned. He'd heard tales of plagues before. There was always some sickness ravaging a distant city, some doom creeping ever closer. But it never reached Lord Pidlington. Why would it? They had nothing worth taking, not even decent roads. The world's miseries tended to pass them by, like a nobleman ignoring a beggar in the street. Sounds like poppycock, Walter grumbled, scratching his crooked nose. Probably just another sweating sickness. My uncle had that once. Sweated like a sinner in church for a week, then got up and plowed a field. Tough as old boots he was. The peddler spread his hands. Believe what you will, but I've seen the roads. More travelers than usual, all heading west. Merchants, monks, even a few knights. None of them stopping long. Like they're running from something. That gave Eustace pause. Knights didn't run from anything. They charged at problems, usually while shouting something in French. If they were fleeing, it wasn't over a few fevers. The village priest, Father Cuthbert, had been listening quietly from the edge of the crowd. Now he stepped forward, his robes flapping like the wings of an underfed crow. "This is a matter for prayer, not gossip," he intoned. "If God sends a trial, we shall endure it. But let us not borrow trouble before it knocks on our door." There were murmurs of agreement, though whether out of piety or a desire to stop talking about death was hard to say. The peddler, sensing the mood shifting, quickly returned to hawking his wares, holding up a dented pot and declaring it fit for a king's kitchen, or at least a very forgiving innkeeper's. The crowd dispersed, the villagers returning to their chores with a new unease hanging over them. Eustace walked back to the fields beside Joan, the baby now asleep against her shoulder. "Do you believe him?" Joan asked quietly. Eustace shrugged. "Peddlers talk. Half of what they say is lies, the other half is exaggerations. But what if it's true?" He didn't have an answer for that. The thought of a sickness that could stack bodies like firewood was too large to grasp, like trying to imagine the ocean when all you'd ever known was the village pond. That night the tavern was quieter than usual. Even old Simon's pig seemed subdued, though that might have been because Simon had finally given up on teaching it to dance and was instead attempting to convince it to balance a turnip on its snout. The pig, for its part, looked profoundly unimpressed. Eustace sat with Walter and a few others, sipping weak ale and listening to the crackle of the fire. The peddler's words hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. "My cousin's wife's brother is a sailor," said Gilbert the Thatcher, breaking the silence. "Says he saw a ship come into Bristol with half the crew dead. The other half died by the time they dropped anchor." Walter snorted. "Your cousin's wife's brother also said he wrestled a mermaid, if I recall." Gilbert scowled. That was a different brother. The conversation drifted, as it always did, to other matters. The upcoming harvest, the Lord's new taxes, the mysterious disappearance of Widow Higgs' best spoon. But the undercurrent remained. Something was coming. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it would pass them by, like so many other calamities. Eustace walked home under a sky thick with stars. The kind of sky that made the world feel vast and small all at once. Joan was already asleep when he slipped inside, the baby curled beside her. Drool the dog lifted his head, gave a half-hearted wag, and went back to snoring. Eustace lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the village at night. The rustle of the thatch, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional cough from a neighbor's hut. Just a cough. Nothing more. But in the morning, the peddler was gone, his cart rolling down the road toward the next village, the next set of ears to fill with whispers. And in the east, the wind carried something dark on its breath. Chapter 3. The arrival of the Grim Reaper. It started with old Nan complaining of a headache. This was not unusual in itself. Old Nan complained about everything from her bunions to the way the wind blew from the east as if personally insulting her. But by midday she was shivering beneath 3 blankets despite the summer heat, her skin slick with sweat. By evening the swellings had appeared, ugly purplish lumps bulging under her arms, the size of walnuts and hot to the touch. Her daughter-in-law Marjorie crossed herself 3 times when she saw them, then ran to fetch Father Cuthbert, who took one look at the marks and immediately began reciting last rites. The villagers gathered outside Nan's hut in a loose semicircle, watching through the open door as the priest anointed her with oil. No one dared step inside. Eustace stood beside Joan, the baby unusually quiet in her arms as if sensing the tension in the air. Walter scratched at his crooked nose, his usual bluster absent. "Well," he muttered, "that's that, then." No one asked what he meant. The peddler's words had lingered in the back of every mind, festering like an unscratchable itch. Now faced with the proof before them, the village seemed collectively unsure whether to scream, pray, or simply stand there blinking like sheep in a thunderstorm. None did before midnight. By morning, 2 more had taken to their beds with fevers. The first was Gilbert the Thatcher, who had laughed loudest at the peddler's warnings. The second was young Tom's mother, Alice, who had spent the previous evening scrubbing her hands raw with vinegar after hearing the news, as if cleanliness could ward off fate. Father Cuthbert moved between the sick, offering prayers and weak comfort. The Lord's steward, a perpetually harassed-looking man named Reginald, arrived from the Manor to survey the situation, took one whiff of the sick-room air, and promptly retreated to report that yes, indeed, things were as bad as they smelled. Panic, when it came, did not arrive as a screaming mob or a riot in the streets. This was Lower Pidlington, after all. Instead, it manifested in small, quiet acts of desperation. Agnes began leaving bowls of milk at the crossroads, an old pagan habit she'd sworn she'd never resort to. Walter took to carrying a clove of garlic in his mouth at all times, which made his already questionable breath downright lethal. Joan sewed little sachets of dry lavender and rosemary, hanging them around the baby's cradle, despite knowing full well that no herb could stop what was coming. Eustace found himself staring at every itch, every twinge in his muscles, wondering if it was the start of something worse. When he woke with a sore throat 3 days after Nan's death, he spent the morning in quiet terror before realizing he'd simply been snoring louder than usual. The deaths came quickly after that. Gilbert went first, his last words being a complaint about the draught. Ellis followed, though not before making young Tom promise to look after his baby sister, a promise the 12-year-old made while weeping into her already cooling hand. By week's end, 5 more had succumbed, including Marjorie, who had nursed old Nan only to collapse herself, her body failing before she could even call for help. The village gravedigger, a taciturn man named Edgar, found himself working from dawn till dusk. When he ran out of space in the churchyard, they began burying people in the fallow field near the woods. There was no time for proper coffins. The dead went into the ground wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared, their names scratched onto sticks if someone remembered to mark them at all. The lord of the manor, Sir Geoffrey, issued a decree that no one from Lower Pidlington was to approach the market town 3 miles away. When a few desperate souls ignored this order, they returned to report that the town's gates were barred, armed guards turning away anyone from infected villages. "We're on our own, then," Joan said one evening as she stirred a meager stew, the firelight flickering across her exhausted face. Eustace nodded, watching Drool the dog sniff at the air near the pot with more hope than sense. The once plump terrier was looking decidedly lean these days, as were they all. With half the village sick or dead, the harvest work had stalled, and what little food they'd stored was dwindling fast. That night, as Eustace lay awake listening to Joan's steady breathing, he heard a new sound, the slow, dragging steps of someone walking past their hut in the dark. Peering through the cracked door, he saw a hunched figure making its way down the lane, a hood drawn low over its face. It stopped at the house where the Miller family had lived, now empty after the parents died, and the children fled to who knew where. The figure hesitated, then slipped inside. In the morning, the Miller house was still quiet, but fresh tracks led away from it toward the woods. When Eustace worked up the courage to look inside, he found a loaf of dark bread and a wedge of cheese laid neatly on the table, along with a small wooden figurine of Saint Roch, patron of plague victims. No note, no explanation, just the quiet charity of someone who knew they might be next. By the second week, the village had settled into a grim routine. The healthy avoided the sick avoided each other, and everyone avoided the dead as much as possible. Father Cuthbert, his robes now permanently stained with sweat and holy oil, moved like a man already half in the grave himself. Young Tom had taken to sitting by the crossroads at dusk, staring down the empty road as if expecting his parents to come walking back. The only one who seemed unchanged was old Simon's pig, which had somehow avoided both the plague and Simon's increasingly desperate attempts to teach it tricks. It wandered the village freely now, rooting through abandoned gardens and sleeping where it pleased. The unofficial lord of a dying manor. Eustace was hauling water from the well when he heard the first cough. It was a dry, rattling sound, the kind that started deep in the chest and clawed its way out. He froze, the bucket halfway to the ground, waiting to see if it came again. It did, and it was coming from him. Chapter 4. The Village Healer's Desperate Remedies. The cough, that had begun as an irritation in Eustace's chest, had settled in like an unwelcome house guest, bringing with it a fever that came and went with no regard for his preferences. He had taken to chewing mint leaves stolen from the abandoned garden behind the blacksmith's house, not because he thought it would help, but because the sharp taste gave him something to focus on besides the growing ache in his limb. Joan had noticed, of course. She noticed everything, especially now, when every sniffle might be a death sentence. But she said nothing, merely pressed a warm cup of something bitter into his hands each morning and evening, her lips pressed into a thin line that betrayed more fear than any scream could have. The village healer, a woman named Mother Ethel, who was neither a mother nor particularly ethereal, had become the busiest person in Lower Pidlington. Her tiny hut, at the edge of the common ground, now had a constant stream of visitors, all shuffling in with hope and shuffling out with dubious concoctions, and the vague air of people who had just traded their last chicken for a handful of wishes. Eustace found himself standing outside her door one misty morning, shifting from foot to foot like a nervous boy waiting to be scolded. The line ahead of him moved slowly, each person emerging clutching some new absurdity. Agnes came out with her hair shorn short, a poultice of what smelled like rancid butter smeared across her scalp. Young Tom carried a small bag of what appeared to be dried frog skins, his expression caught between hope and revulsion. When Eustace finally ducked through the low doorway, the smell hit him like a physical blow, a thick miasma of herbs, vinegar, and something suspiciously like rotting meat. Mother Ethel sat amidst the chaos like a queen holding court over a kingdom of desperation. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, jars of murky liquids lined crude shelves, and in one corner a raven in a wicker cage regarded him with unsettling intelligence. "Well?" Mother Ethel barked before he could speak. She was a wiry woman with one milky eye and fingers stained yellow from countless remedies. "Spit it out, man. Fever? Cough? The lumps?" "Just a cough," Eustace said, then immediately regretted the admission as her good eye narrowed. "Just a cough," she repeated mockingly. "Just the end of the world, more like. Open your mouth." What followed was the most thorough and uncomfortable examination of Eustace's life. Mother Ethel peered down his throat, prodded his neck, made him spit into a bowl which she then studied with disturbing intensity, and finally pressed her ear to his chest with such force he worried she might burrow straight through to his ribs. When she straightened at last, her expression was unreadable. "Not the death," she pronounced. "Not yet, anyway. Probably just the regular sort of dying." Eustace wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or insulted. Mother Ethel turned to her shelves, muttering to herself as she pulled down jars and bundles. "What we need is something to bring the humors back into balance. Your phlegm's clearly in rebellion, probably due to an overabundance of black bile. Or maybe it's the other way around. Damned if I can remember today." She began mixing ingredients with the practiced carelessness of someone who had long since stopped believing in measurements. Into a small clay pot went powdered oak gall, something that might have been dried lizard, a generous helping of honey to mask the taste, and finally a splash of liquid from an unlabeled bottle that made Eustace's eyes water just from the fumes. "Drink this morning and night," she instructed, pressing the pot into his hands. "And wear this." She produced a small leather pouch on a cord. "Azafoetida inside. Smells like Satan's backside, but it'll keep the bad air away." Eustace accepted both remedies with the solemnity the moment demanded, though privately he thought the pouch smelled like something had died in it weeks ago, and nobody had bothered to check. Outside, the village had taken on the appearance of a particularly strange festival. Walter walked by with a dead toad tied around his neck like a grotesque pendant. Agnes was rubbing her shorn head with what looked like crushed snails. Over by the well, Father Cuthbert was leading a group in prayer while simultaneously holding a bunch of lavender under his nose, a curious mix of piety and precaution. Joan was less than impressed when Eustace returned with his prizes. "You paid our last 2 eggs for this?" she asked, sniffing the pot and immediately recoiling. "It smells like something Drool would roll in." Drool, as if hearing his name, trotted over to investigate the pouch and promptly sneezed 3 times in rapid succession. "It can't hurt," Eustace said, which was almost certainly a lie, but one they both chose to believe. That night, as he choked down the first dose of Mother Ethel's concoction, a flavor that somehow managed to be bitter, sweet, and putrid all at once, Eustace noticed Joan slipping something into her own mouth. When questioned, she reluctantly produced a small wax ball. "Mouse liver," she admitted. "Wrapped in beeswax. Marjorie swore by it before she—" The sentence trailed off, but Eustace understood. They were all grasping at straws now, collecting remedies like charms against the inevitable. The next morning brought a new development. A traveling physician had arrived in the village, his long robes and beaked mask, marking him as either a savior or a particularly ominous omen. He set up a makeshift clinic in the square, his assistant, a sullen-looking youth, ringing a bell and announcing that Dr. Aldous could provide sure protection against the pestilence, guaranteed by the finest universities of Padua. For a price, of course. Curious despite himself, Eustace joined the gathering crowd. Dr. Aldous stood atop an overturned barrel, his beaked mask giving him the appearance of some giant, malformed bird. When he spoke, his voice echoed strangely from within the mask. "Good people, the cause of your suffering is clear. The air itself has become corrupted, filled with invisible miasmas that carry the seeds of disease. But fear not. Science has provided the answer." With a dramatic flourish, he produced a glass jar containing what looked like a small, pickled creature. "The mighty basilisk, destroyer of pestilence. Merely possessing a fragment of its remains will shield you from harm." Eustace wasn't sure what a basilisk was supposed to look like, but the thing in the jar suspiciously resembled a rooster with a fishtail glued to it. Still, the villagers murmured appreciatively. Science, after all, had to be better than old wives' tales. For the next hour, Dr. Aldous demonstrated his wares. There were amulets made from dragon's teeth, likely sheep molars, vials of unicorn horn powder, probably ground bone, and small mirrors that he claimed would reflect the bad humors away. His piece de resistance was a live leech that he promised would draw out the pestilential humors if applied directly to the swellings. "He's a fraud," Joan whispered as they watched a desperate widow trade her late husband's boots for a sliver of basilisk bone. "Probably," Eustace agreed. "But what if he's not?" That was the crux of it, of course. In the face of certain death, even certain fraud became worth the gamble. Mother Ethel, unsurprisingly, took a dim view of the competition. She stormed into the square just as Dr. Aldous was demonstrating how to properly bleed a patient, her one good eye blazing with indignation. "Charlatan!" she shrieked, brandishing a wooden spoon like a weapon. "You'd suck these people dry as last year's apples, and leave them nothing but empty purses and false hope." Dr. Aldous drew himself up to his full height, which was considerable even without the mask. "Madam, I assure you my methods are approved by the finest medical minds of our age. Unlike some who still cling to peasant superstitions." What followed was less a debate on medical ethics and more a shouting match that culminated in Mother Ethel throwing a clump of something unidentifiable, but definitely organic, at Dr. Aldous's mask. The doctor retaliated by dumping a vial of liquid over her head, which turned out to be urine, a substance he claimed had powerful curative properties when applied externally. The spectacle might have been amusing under different circumstances. Now, it just felt like watching two bald men fight over a comb while the village burned down around them. That evening, as Eustace prepared to take his second dose of Mother Ethel's remedy, he paused, the pot halfway to his lips. Outside he could hear Dr. Aldous's assistant still ringing that damn bell, promising salvation for the right price. Somewhere in the distance, someone was wailing. Whether from grief or pain he couldn't tell. He drank the concoction in one gulp, the taste barely registering anymore. Beside him, Joan popped another wax-wrapped mouse liver into her mouth without comment. Somewhere in the village, a child laughed unexpectedly, the sound sharp and bright against the gloom. For a moment, just a moment, it almost sounded like hope. Then the coughing started again, and the moment passed. Tomorrow would bring more remedies, more promises, more desperate bargains struck with a universe that seemed determined not to listen. But tonight they were still alive, and that would have to be enough. Chapter 5. The Great Exodus. The first to leave were the ones with somewhere to go. Sir Geoffrey's steward appeared one morning with a sealed letter from the Manor, his horse skittish and wide-eyed, as if it too sensed the miasma of death clinging to the village. The parchment, which Father Cuthbert read aloud in the square with as much dignity as a man could muster, while scratching at a suspicious new rash, announced that the Lord's household had relocated to his winter estate, until such time as God sees fit to lift this trial from his faithful servant. No one was fooled. The Lord had fled, and those with enough coin or connections quickly followed suit. Margaret the alewife packed up her remaining barrels, and left under cover of darkness, her cart creaking under the weight of hoarded supplies. The blacksmith, his arms still thick with muscle despite the hunger gnawing at them all, simply walked away one evening without a word, his tools slung over his shoulder in a bundle that clanked with every step. Even young Tom, who had buried both parents in the same week, vanished one morning with his little sister in tow, leaving behind only a small pile of dried frog skins and a worn-out shoe too broken to take along. Eustace watched them go from the doorway of his hut, his cough now a constant companion that rattled in his chest like a prisoner shaking the bars of his cell. Joan stood beside him, the baby, miraculously still healthy, asleep against her shoulder. They had no family beyond the village, no distant relatives to take them in. For people like them, flight was less an escape than a slower form of suicide. "We could try for the monastery," Joan said one evening as they picked at a thin stew made from the last of their stored beans. The monks at St. Bedtime, 5 miles to the west, were said to be taking in refugees, though rumor had it they were only accepting those who could pay with labor or coin. Eustace shook his head, then immediately regretted it as the motion sent a fresh wave of dizziness through him. "We'd never make it." It was the truth, though neither of them wanted to say it aloud. Joan was strong, but the baby would slow them down, and Eustace's fever came and went like an unreliable house guest, leaving him weak and sweating at unpredictable intervals. The village grew quieter with each departure. Doors that had once stood open now remained shut, either because the occupants had fled, or because they lay inside, too ill to move. The only constant sounds were the occasional wail of grief, the ever-present cawing of crows grown fat on plague corpses, and the maddeningly cheerful clucking of the chickens that no one had bothered to catch when their owners abandoned them. Dr. Aldous, that purveyor of false hope, had long since decamped for greener pastures, though not before selling every last scrap of his dubious remedies to the desperate. Only Mother Ethel remained, moving through the dying village like a spectre, her sack of herbs and potions growing lighter with each passing day as her options dwindled along with her patients. The worst part, Eustace thought as he watched yet another family bundle their meager possessions onto a handcart, wasn't the abandonment itself. It was the way no one met each other's eyes as they left. The way they crept away at dawn or dusk, as if ashamed to be seen choosing life over loyalty. The way those left behind didn't even bother to curse them, because what was the point? Walter was one of the last to go. He showed up at Eustace's door one morning, with a sack slung over his shoulder and a fresh garlic clove wedged in his cheek. "My sister's man has a farm near Ipswich," he said by way of explanation, shifting from foot to foot like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Zays'll take me in if I can get there before the roads close." Eustace nodded. It made sense. Walter had always been good with animals, and his sister had married above her station. There was no reason for him to stay, and every reason to go. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two men who had known each other since childhood, but who now had nothing left to say. Finally, Walter spat out the garlic and pressed it into Eustace's hand. "For the cough," he muttered. Then he turned and walked away, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust that hung in the still air long after had disappeared down the road. That night, as Eustace lay sweating despite the autumn chill, he heard a new sound outside, the soft, shuffling footsteps of someone trying very hard not to be heard. Peering through a crack in the door, he saw a hunched figure moving from house to house, pausing at each to leave something by the threshold. When the figure had moved on, Eustace crept outside to investigate. There, sitting neatly beside his door, was a small loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese wrapped in leaves, and a handful of dried apples. Similar bundles sat before the few other occupied houses. The next morning, the gifts were gone, collected by unseen hands. But the mystery of their origin was solved when Agnes appeared at the well, her shorn head now covered with a ragged scarf. She met Eustace's gaze steadily, her hands busy grinding something in a mortar. "Don't look so surprised," she said. "Just because some of us can't believe doesn't mean we have to act like animals." It turned out Agnes had been hoarding supplies in her root cellar since before the first death. Now she was distributing them evenly among those who remained, a quiet act of rebellion against the despair that threatened to swallow them all. By week's end, Lower Pidlington was a ghost of its former self. Only a handful of households remained occupied, their smoke rising thin and pale against the gray sky. The fields stood untended, the last of the harvest rotting where it had fallen. Even old Simon's pig seemed to sense the change, wandering the empty lanes with less enthusiasm than before, as if missing the audience for its antics. Father Cuthbert still held Mass each Sunday, though his congregation had dwindled to a handful of souls. He had stopped preaching about God's mercy, and now spoke mostly of perseverance, his sermons punctuated by coughing fits that left him gasping for breath. Mother Ethel, her supplies nearly exhausted, had taken to brewing one giant pot of preventative tonic each morning and leaving it outside her hut for anyone to take. No one asked what was in it anymore. They simply drank their share and tried not to think about the increasing number of empty houses around them. The last to leave was, ironically, the one person everyone had expected to stay. Father Cuthbert announced one morning that the bishop had summoned all surviving clergy to a council at the cathedral. "To pray for deliverance," he explained, though his eyes darted nervously as he said it. No one challenged him. No one even spoke as he packed his few belongings onto a donkey borrowed from the abandoned miller's house. They simply watched as he walked away, his robes flapping around his thin legs like the wings of a grounded bird. That evening, Eustace sat outside his hut watching the sunset paint the abandoned village in shades of orange and gold. Joan joined him, the baby asleep in her arms. Somewhere in the distance a door banged open and shut in the wind, the sound lonely and aimless. "Do you think it will ever come back?" Joan asked quietly. "The village, I mean." Eustace considered the question. He thought of the empty fields, the untended graves, the houses standing silent and dark. He thought of all the stories that had ended here, and the few that stubbornly persisted. "Maybe," he said at last, "if we're here to see it." And for now, at least, they still were. Chapter 6. Burying the dead, or not. Edgar the gravedigger was the first to give up. One morning, Eustace found him sitting motionless beside a half-dug grave, his shovel lying across his lap like a fallen scepter. His face was pale beneath a coating of dirt, and when Eustace called his name, Edgar simply looked up with hollow eyes and said, "What's the point?" It wasn't a question so much as a statement of surrender. The churchyard was full. The fallow field beyond the woods was full. Every time Edgar managed to carve out a new patch of earth, 2 more bodies would appear like some grim arithmetic of despair. The next death was Marjorie's mother, found stiff in her bed with a look of surprise frozen on her face, as if death had been an unexpected guest. This time, Edgar didn't even bother with the pretense of digging. He and Eustace simply carried her out to the field, and laid her atop 3 other recent arrivals, covering the pile with a thin scattering of dirt that the next rain would likely wash away. After that they stopped pretending to bury people altogether. The dead were left where they fell, or if someone found them in time, dragged to the edge of the field and left in rows that grew longer each day. The village stank of rotting meat and something sweeter, more cloying, the particular scent of human decay that clung to clothes and hair long after you left its presence. Even the ever-present flies seemed overwhelmed, moving sluggishly between corpses as if drunk on abundance. Eustace found himself developing a morbid routine. Each morning he would walk through the silent village, checking which doors stood ajar, the universal signal that another soul had departed. Then he would drag the body out, trying not to look at the face too closely in case it was someone he'd known well. Sometimes he covered them with a sheet or cloak more out of habit than any real sense of decorum. Joan had stopped letting the baby crawl on the floor, after finding her playing with a rat that had been feeding on something unspeakable in the corner of their hut. Now the child spent her days tied to Joan's back with a length of cloth, watching the world go by over her mother's shoulder with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The animals, at least, were thriving. Dogs that had once been pets now moved in feral packs, their ribs showing but their eyes bright with easy meals. Crows gathered in the trees like a dark, judgmental audience, their cries the only sermons the village heard, now that Father Cuthbert was gone. And old Simon's pig had grown fat beyond imagining, its belly nearly dragging on the ground as it waddled from house to house, feasting on whatever it found. Eustace had a dream one night that the pig had grown as large as a cottage, its beady eyes glowing in the dark as it rooted through graves with its snout. He woke sweating, the cough tearing at his chest, and found Joan already awake beside him, her eyes reflecting the faint moonlight coming through the cracks in the walls. "We should burn them," she said quietly. He knew what she meant. The bodies, the ones piling up at the edge of the field, drawing scavengers and disease alike. It made sense. It was practical. And yet the idea of setting fire to neighbors he'd known his entire life felt like crossing some invisible line between doing what was necessary and admitting they were truly lost. In the end, nature made the decision for them. A storm rolled in one evening, the kind that made the huts tremble and sent drool whimpering into the farthest corner. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the field of corpses in brief, horrifying snapshots. Then came the rain, not the gentle drizzle they were used to, but a deluge that turned the paths to rivers and the field to a churning sea of mud. By morning, half the bodies were gone, washed away into the woods or buried under landslides of wet earth. The remaining ones lay in awkward poses, limbs jutting at unnatural angles like some macabre sculpture garden. The stench had diminished, replaced by the cleaner smell of rain and turned soil. Eustace stood at the edge of the field, watching the water swirl around his boots. He should have felt something, horror, grief, even relief. Instead, there was just a numb acceptance, the same feeling he got when looking at a field that needed plowing or a roof that needed thatching. Just another chore in an endless list of chores. Agnes joined him, her scarf soaked through and clinging to her skull. She carried a basket of what looked like wild onions, though these days no one was particular about what they ate. "Found these by the stream," she said, following his gaze to the field. "Buried 6 of my own out here. Can't even remember where now." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the water gurgle through the newly formed channels in the earth. Somewhere downstream, the bones of their neighbors would be piling up against rocks and fallen branches, forming dams of the dead that some future traveler might stumble upon and wonder at. Back in the village, the few remaining survivors went about their business with the quiet determination of people who had run out of tears. Mother Ethel still brewed her potions, though her hands shook now, and her voice had taken on a rasping quality that didn't bode well. The widow Cooper had taken to feeding the chickens that wandered the village, calling each by name as if they were the children she'd lost. And still, somehow, life persisted. The baby took her first unsteady steps between the pallets of the sick. A stubborn patch of late-blooming flowers pushed through the mud near the well. The pig, now undoubtedly the fattest creature for miles, gave birth to a litter of squealing piglets that would never know the world before the dying began. That night, as Eustace lay awake, listening to Joan's steady breathing and the baby's soft snores, he realized with a start that his cough had eased. The fever that had come and gone like an unreliable visitor seemed to have departed for good. Outside, the moon shone down on the wreckage of the village, painting the empty houses and disturbed earth in shades of silver and black. Somewhere in the distance, a lone dog howled, not the hungry cry of a scavenger, but the long, mournful note of a creature that simply needed to announce its existence to the uncaring night. Eustace understood the impulse. Tomorrow would bring more deaths, more bodies to move or ignore. But tonight, against all odds, he was alive. And for now, that would have to be enough. Chapter 7. The Priest's Crisis of Faith. Father Cuthbert returned to Lower Pidlington on a morning when the mist clung to the ground like a shroud. He came alone, his borrowed donkey having died somewhere along the road, and his once fine robes now reduced to tattered strips that fluttered around his ankles as he walked. The bishop's council had dispersed when 3 of the attending priests collapsed during vespers, their blackened tongues lolling from their mouths like overripe figs. The village he returned to was barely recognizable. Where once there had been life, however hard, however poor, now there were only empty houses with doors that swung on broken hinges, fields gone to seed, and the ever-present stench of death that no amount of rain could wash away. The church still stood, though its roof had begun to sag in one corner, and someone had stolen the brass candlesticks from the altar. Father Cuthbert knelt before that empty altar now, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles stood out white as bone. The words of the familiar prayers came to his lips, but they tasted like ashes. "Why?" he whispered to the crucifix hanging crooked on the wall. "Why them? Why here?" The Christ figure did not answer. It never did. Agnes found him there hours later, still on his knees but no longer praying, simply staring at the wall with red-rimmed eyes. She cleared her throat, not out of respect, but because the plague had left her with a persistent tickle in her lungs, and dropped a sack of turnips at his feet. "You look like hell," she observed. Father Cuthbert blinked up at her. Agnes had never been one for reverence, even before the dying began. "I went to seek guidance," he said hoarsely. "I returned with none." Agnes snorted and sat heavily on the pew beside him. The wood creaked ominously. "Guidance? What we need is more food, and maybe a miracle or two. She eyed the priest critically. You're not looking so good yourself. He wasn't. The rash that had started as an irritation during his journey had spread down his neck, angry red tracks that itched terribly. His hands shook when he tried to lift them, and there was a new, alarming rattle in his chest that hadn't been there before. I'm fine, he lied. Agnes didn't bother contradicting him. Instead, she reached into her sleeve and pulled out a small, grimy bottle. Mother Ethel's last batch, made it special before she took to her bed, said you'd need it when you got back. Father Cuthbert took the bottle with trembling fingers. The liquid inside was murky green, and smelled strongly of mint and something far less pleasant. She's ill. Dead 3 days now, Agnes said matter-of-factly. We put her out with the others. The priest's hands tightened around the bottle. Another soul he'd failed to see properly buried. Another name to add to the endless list in his mind. That evening, he attempted to hold Mass for the first time since his return. A handful of villagers came, Eustace and Joan with the baby, Agnes, the widow Cooper, and old Harold, who had been deaf as a post since before the plague began, but came anyway out of habit. Father Cuthbert stood before them in his tattered vestments, the stolen candlesticks replaced with crude wooden ones Eustace had carved, and found he had no sermon to give. The words of comfort and hope he'd spent a lifetime memorizing stuck in his throat like fish bones. Instead, he simply said, I don't know why this is happening. The admission hung in the air, shocking in its honesty. A priest wasn't supposed to admit doubt any more than a blacksmith was supposed to admit he didn't know how to shoe a horse. Joan shifted the baby on her hip. None of us do, she said quietly. They sat in silence for a while, the empty pews around them, a stark reminder of all the voices that should have been filling the space with murmured prayers and shuffling feet. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the walls like a ghost trying to get in. Father Cuthbert found himself staring at the crucifix again. The figure of Christ seemed to look back at him with an expression that could be read as either sorrow or reproach, depending on the angle. Hadn't he devoted his life to serving God? Hadn't he baptized these people, married them, buried their parents? Why then was he left standing in this empty church with nothing to offer but his own confusion? The baby began to fuss, breaking the silence. Joan stood to leave, but Father Cuthbert raised a hand. Wait, he said. Then, with more certainty than he'd felt in weeks, bring her here. Joan hesitated, then stepped forward and placed the squirming child in the priest's arms. Father Cuthbert looked down at the small face, unmarked by plague, unbroken by grief, and felt something stir in his chest that wasn't pain or fever. He carried the baby to the font, the others trailing behind in silent curiosity. There was no holy water. It had all been used or spilled long ago. But the rainwater that had collected in the basin would have to do. Almighty God, he began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke, we give you thanks for this child, and for all the children who will remember our names when we are gone. It wasn't the proper baptismal rite. It wasn't even particularly good theology. But as the priest traced a wet cross on the baby's forehead, Eustace and Joan exchanged a look that might have been hope, or something very like it. Afterward, Father Cuthbert returned to his tiny house beside the church. The place was a mess. Someone had stolen his blanket and his few pieces of decent pottery. But the small wooden statue of the Virgin Mary still stood on the shelf where he'd left it. He picked it up, brushing dust from the serene face, and placed it carefully in the center of the table. Then he sat down, opened Agnes's bottle, and drank deeply. The liquid burned going down, but when the coughing fit passed, he realized his chest felt clearer than it had in weeks. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying away the worst of the stench from the field of the dead. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked, and further off, the unmistakable squeal of old Simon's pig echoed through the empty lanes. Father Cuthbert closed his eyes and, for the first time in months, prayed without expecting an answer. Chapter 8. The Opportunists, profiting from misery. The first looters arrived just as the last of the village's original inhabitants were either dying or deciding they'd rather die somewhere else. They came in pairs and trios, rough-looking men with hungry eyes and carts that suspiciously resembled ones Eustace remembered from neighboring villages. They moved through Lower Pidlington like rats through a granary, prying open shutters and testing door latches with the practiced ease of people who had done this before. Eustace watched from the shadow of his doorway as two such men, one tall and thin as a rake, the other built like a barrel with legs, rummaged through the empty hut across the lane. The thin one emerged triumphantly waving a cooking pot, while the barrel-chested one complained loudly about the lack of decent loot. "Nothing but rubbish," Barrel-chest grumbled, kicking at a wooden bowl that had belonged to old Widow Cooper before she'd followed her children into the ground. "Where's the silver? The good linens?" "Keep looking," the thin one said. "Plenty more houses to check. Whole village is ripe for picking." Eustace considered confronting them, but the cough that had retreated in recent weeks chose that moment to remind him of its presence. He doubled over, muffling the sound in his sleeve, and when he looked up again, the looters had moved on to richer pastures. It turned out the thieves were just the beginning. As word spread that Lower Pidlington was more ghost town than living village, all sorts of interesting characters came crawling out of the woodwork. A self-proclaimed death cleaner arrived one morning with a cart full of lye and a nose plug made of beeswax. For a modest fee, he promised to purify homes where plague victims had died, making them safe for new occupants. Eustace watched as the man performed his ritual on 3 houses, splashing murky liquid on the walls while chanting what sounded like bad Latin, then nailing crude wooden crosses to the doors to mark them clean. The whole process took less time than it took to milk a goat, and seemed about as effective. The death cleaner had barely left when a pair of brothers showed up with a wagon full of relics, guaranteed to ward off plague. Their inventory included what they claimed was a finger bone of St. Sebastian, suspiciously white and smooth, like polished wood, a vial of water from the River Jordan, cloudy and with a distinct odor of pond scum, and, most impressively, a feather from the wing of the Archangel Gabriel himself. "How'd you come by that?" Joan asked, eyeing the feather that looked remarkably like one from the particularly large goose that had terrorized the miller's children last spring. The older brother drew himself up with an air of wounded dignity. "Divine providence, good woman. The angel appeared to our sainted mother in a dream, and left this as protection for these troubled times." Joan snorted. "Your sainted mother must have been plucking angels in her sleep then. That's a goose feather if I ever saw one." The brothers left in a huff, though not before selling their entire stock to a group of travelers who had stopped to water their horses at the village well. Even the animals got in on the act. Old Simon's pig, now the undisputed ruler of the village, had developed a keen sense for when someone new arrived. She would appear as if by magic whenever strangers dismounted, her beady eyes fixed on their saddlebags with an intelligence that was frankly unsettling. More than one visitor found themselves missing small items after encountering her. A bit of bread here, a strip of dried meat there. The pig accepted these tributes with a grunt of approval, then waddled off to add them to her growing hoard beneath the abandoned blacksmith's shop. The most brazen opportunist arrived on a sunny afternoon, when even the flies seemed too lethargic to bother with the corpses in the field. He rode a fine black mare and wore clothes that marked him as someone who had done very well for himself during the recent troubles. "Good people of Lower Pidlington," he called, though the only people within earshot were Eustace, Joan, and Agnes, who had come to complain about the noise. "I bring glad tidings." The glad tidings, it turned out, were an offer to buy up distressed properties at a generous price. The man, who introduced himself as Geoffrey of somewhere or other, produced a parchment scroll covered in cramped writing and waved it about like a banner. "With so many unfortunate vacancies," he said, his smile revealing several gold-capped teeth, "it makes sense to consolidate holdings. I'm prepared to offer 5 silver pennies per dwelling." Agnes laughed so hard she had to sit down. 5 pennies? For a whole house? What are you planning to do with them? Burn them for warmth? Geoffrey's smile didn't waver. 6 pennies then for you good folk, and I'll throw in a charm against the plague. He produced a small wooden disc from his pouch. Blessed by the Pope himself. The Pope's dead, Jones said flatly. His successor then, Geoffrey amended without missing a beat. In the end, no one sold their homes, though Geoffrey did manage to acquire 3 abandoned properties by settling outstanding debts with the local tavern keeper's ghost. At least that was the story he gave when Father Cuthbert asked about the hastily drawn-up deeds in his possession. The priest had taken to patrolling the village in the evenings, his tattered robes flapping around his legs as he chased off the worst of the opportunists. He developed a particularly effective method involving holy water, or what he claimed was holy water. Rumor had it he'd resorted to well water with a pinch of salt, and dire warnings about divine retribution. It was during one such patrol that he encountered the most unusual profiteer of all. The woman, if it was a woman, stood nearly 7 feet tall and wore a cloak made entirely of what appeared to be crow feathers. She had set up shop in the village square, a makeshift stall displaying an array of bottles and pouches that made Mother Ethel's remedies look downright scientific by comparison. Protection from pestilence, she croaked in a voice like gravel in a tin cup. Charms to ward off death, potions to make your enemies wither where they stand. Father Cuthbert approached cautiously. Good woman, this village has suffered enough without. The woman turned, revealing a face that was either very old or very poorly preserved. Ah, a man of God. Tell me, Holy Father, does your faith protect you from the sickness? She gestured to the empty lanes around them. Seems not. The priest opened his mouth to respond, but at that moment a gust of wind caught the woman's cloak, sending a flurry of black feathers swirling around them. When the air cleared, the stall stood empty. Its proprietor vanished without a trace. Only a single black feather remained, spinning slowly on the cobbles where she had stood. Father Cuthbert picked it up, half expecting it to dissolve in his hands. When it didn't, he tucked it into his sleeve and went to warn the others about this latest visitor. By nightfall, the feather seller was the talk of what remained of the village. Agnes claimed she was a witch. Joan thought she was just another charlatan with a flair for the dramatic. Eustace, who had been napping during the whole encounter, reserved judgment but made sure to check that all their doors were securely barred that night. As it turned out, none of them needed to worry. The mysterious woman never returned, though for weeks afterward, villagers would occasionally find black feathers in odd places, tucked into door frames, floating in water buckets, once even stuck to the side of old Simon's pig, like some bizarre decoration. The last of the opportunists came in the form of a tax collector from the neighboring lord's estate. The man, a pinch-faced individual with a ledger book and a perpetual sniffle, arrived just as the survivors were beginning to think they might actually live through this ordeal. By order of Lord de Montfort, he announced to the bemused gathering of Eustace, Joan, Agnes, Father Cuthbert, and the pig, who seemed to find the tax collector's boots particularly interesting, all outstanding levies must be paid in full by Michaelmas. The villagers looked at each other, then at the empty fields, then at the ruins of what had once been their homes. Agnes spoke for all of them when she said, "You want taxes? Take your pick of the houses. Most of them are empty now." The tax collector, to his credit, seemed to realize the absurdity of his position. He made a few half-hearted notes in his ledger, accepted a cup of weak ale from Joan, and left without collecting so much as a bent penny. That night, as the sun set over the quiet wreckage of Lower Pidlington, Eustace and Joan sat outside their hut, sharing a loaf of bread Agnes had scavenged from somewhere. The baby played at their feet, chasing a beetle that scuttled through the dust. "Think more of them will come?" Joan asked, nodding toward the road where so many opportunists had come and gone. Eustace tore off a piece of bread and considered the question. "Probably," he said at last. "Where there's misery, there's always someone looking to profit from it." Joan sighed and leaned against him. Then I suppose we'll just have to survive long enough to disappoint them. And with that modest ambition, they went inside to face another night in the plague-racked remains of what had once been a village. Outside, old Simon's pig rooted through the remains of the feather seller's stall, grunting contentedly as she added another strange treasure to her growing collection beneath the blacksmith's shop. Chapter 9. The Abandoned Fields. The wheat should have been harvested weeks ago. Eustace stood at the edge of what had once been the village's most fertile field, now a tangled mess of overripe grain and opportunistic weeds. The stalks, heavy with heads that had long since begun to droop and split, rustled in the breeze like old men whispering secrets. Here and there, patches had collapsed entirely, the grain rotting where it fell, filling the air with a sweet, sickly odor that attracted clouds of buzzing insects. He bent and picked up a fallen stalk, rubbing the grains between his fingers. They came away easily, leaving behind a powdery residue that smelled faintly of mildew. A few more weeks of this and the entire crop would be fit for nothing but pig feed, if there were any pigs left to eat it besides old Simon's ever-expanding brood. A sound caught his attention, and he turned to see Joan approaching with the baby on her hip and a wicker basket over her arm. She surveyed the field with the same grim expression Eustace knew was on his own face. Agnes says there might still be some good patches near the far edge, Joan said, shifting the baby to her other hip. The child had grown alarmingly thin in recent weeks, her face losing its baby fat far too quickly. If we can gather enough to last the winter. She didn't finish the thought. They both knew the chances of finding enough unspoiled grain to last through the coming winter were slim at best. With most of the village dead or fled, there simply weren't enough hands to properly harvest what remained before it spoiled entirely. They worked in silence, moving through the field like ghosts, carefully testing each stand of wheat before cutting the best stalks and adding them to Joan's basket. It was slow, painstaking work, and after an hour the basket was barely a quarter full. A shadow fell across the field as clouds moved in, threatening rain. Eustace straightened, rubbing the small of his back where an old injury always made itself known at the worst possible times. He could feel Joan watching him, could see the unspoken question in her eyes. "We'll manage," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure how. The first drops began to fall as they made their way back to the village, the rain turning the path to mud beneath their feet. Around them, the other fields stood equally neglected. The barley patch now home to more rabbits than grain, the vegetable gardens overtaken by weeds and wild herbs. Even the apple trees at the far edge of the common ground drooped under the weight of unpicked fruit, much of it already rotting on the branch. Father Cuthbert met them at the edge of the village, his robes soaked through and clinging to his thin frame. He carried a small sack that clinked suspiciously as he moved. "God provides," he said with forced cheer, holding up the sack. "Found 3 bottles of last year's cider in the old cellar behind the church. The Lord works in mysterious ways indeed." Eustace couldn't help but notice the priest's hands shook as he spoke, and there was a new gauntness to his face that hadn't been there a week ago. Still, he accepted the offered bottle with a nod of thanks, the rough glass cool against his palm. That night, they gathered in what passed for the village square. Eustace and Joan, Agnes, Father Cuthbert, and the widow Cooper, who had somehow survived when so many others hadn't. Old Simon's pig and her growing brood rooted nearby, their contented grunts a strange counterpoint to the grim conversation. "We need to think about winter," Joan said bluntly, rocking the baby in her arms. The child had fallen into a fitful sleep, her small face pinched even in rest. "What grain we've managed to salvage won't last a month, let alone through to spring." Agnes, who had been picking at a callus on her palm, looked up. "There's always the Lord's stores." A heavy silence fell over the group. The Lord's stores, the barns and granaries kept stocked with food collected from their own labor through years of taxes and tithes, stood half a day's walk away at the Manor. Well guarded, or at least they had been before the plague. Father Cuthbert cleared his throat. "Stealing is a sin," he said, though without much conviction. "So is starving to death when there's food to be had," Agnes shot back. "Besides, who's going to stop us? The bailiff's dead. The steward's dead. For all we know, the Lord himself is dead by now." Eustace stared into the fire, watching the flames lick at the damp wood. The idea of taking what they needed had a certain brutal logic to it. The strong survived, the weak perished. Wasn't that the way of things now? But then he looked at Joan, at the baby in her arms, and thought of what kind of world they'd be surviving in if every last shred of decency was stripped away with the wheat. "There might be another way," he said slowly. "The Southfield isn't completely lost yet. If we can get enough people working it, we might salvage enough to get by." Joan and Agnes exchanged glances. "What people?" Joan asked gently. Eustace looked around their small circle, then nodded toward where old Simon's pig lay contentedly in the dirt. "We start with who we have." And so the next morning, the remaining inhabitants of Lower Pidlington, all 5 of them, plus the baby and the ever-increasing pig population, set to work in the Southfield. It was back-breaking labor, made worse by the knowledge that they were weeks behind where they should have been, but they worked nonetheless. Agnes proved surprisingly adept at binding sheaves despite her arthritic hands. Father Cuthbert, though clearly weakening by the day, managed to shock everyone by knowing exactly how to stack the grain to best dry in the intermittent sunlight. Even the widow Cooper, who had spent most of her life as a weaver and knew nothing of farming, did her best to gather the fallen stalks into piles. And the pigs? Well, the pigs mostly got in the way, rooting up more grain than they left behind. But Eustace couldn't bring himself to begrudge them. They, at least, would go into winter well fed. By week's end they'd managed to salvage perhaps a third of what the field might have yielded in better times. It wasn't enough, not nearly, but it was something. As they stacked the last of the sheaves in the old tiled barn, now empty of everything but dust and spider webs, Joan leaned against Eustace, her body warmed, despite the chill autumn air. "We'll need to hunt," she murmured. "Set snares. Maybe fish the stream if the water hasn't gone foul." Eustace nodded, watching as Father Cuthbert carefully counted their meager stores, his lips moving silently as he tallied the days each bushel might buy them. It was a pitiful arithmetic against the long winter ahead, but it was all they had. As dusk fell, a strange sound echoed across the abandoned fields, the squeal of a pig in distress. Eustace and Joan hurried toward the noise, finding Agnes standing over old Simon's prize, sow, who lay on her side panting heavily. "More piglets coming," Agnes announced matter-of-factly. "Seems our friend here didn't wait for spring like sensible creatures do." Joan knelt beside the laboring animal, her hands gentle as she checked the sow's progress. The baby, fascinated by the proceedings, reached out tiny hands toward the pig's heaving flank. "At least someone's prospering," Joan said wryly as the first of the new piglets made its squalling entrance into the world. Eustace watched the scene, the panting sow, the squirming piglets, Joan's tired but determined face, the baby's wide-eyed wonder, and felt something that might have been hope or something very like it. They would survive this. They had to. Chapter 10. The Loneliest Feast. Agnes set the table for 5. It was a foolish thing to do, she knew. The bread would go stale, the cheese would dry out, and the precious salted pork she'd been hoarding in her cellar would only spoil if left uneaten. Still, she arranged the portions with meticulous care, placing each item just so on the rough wooden table that had once groaned under the weight of family meals. The first place was for her brother Edmund, dead these 20 years, but still remembered as the only person who'd ever made her laugh until she cried. His plate received an extra slice of bread, because he'd always been a great one for bread. Next came her sister Mary's spot, marked by the chipped blue cup that had somehow survived when so much else had been lost. Mary had been fond of small, pretty things, So Agnes added a sprig of late-blooming thyme beside the cup, its tiny purple flowers barely visible in the dim light. Her mother's place was set with the best knife, the one with the bone handle that had been a wedding gift from a grandfather neither of them could remember. The old woman had always insisted on proper cutting implements, claiming that tearing at one's food was for animals and the French. And finally, the spot at the foot of the table where her father had held court every evening, doling out portions and pronouncements with equal solemnity. His plate she piled high with the choicest bits, the crispiest edge of the pork, the heartiest chunk of cheese. The man had worked hard all his life. Death shouldn't change that. Her own place was barely set at all. Just a wooden bowl and a spoon, wedged in between her parents as it had been when she was small. The fire crackled in the hearth, its light flickering across the empty benches. Outside, the wind howled through the empty village, rattling loose shutters and moaning down abandoned chimneys. Somewhere in the distance, old Simon's pigs rooted through the remains of someone's garden, their contented grunts carrying through the thin walls. Agnes sat down and surveyed the feast. It was more food than she'd seen in one place since the dying began, more than she could possibly eat in a week of meals. The scent of the pork made her stomach clench with hunger, but she waited, hands folded in her lap, just as her father had always insisted. "Grace," she murmured and closed her eyes. The words came haltingly at first, then more smoothly as she fell into the familiar rhythm. "For what we are about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful. Bless this food to our use, and us to thy service, and keep us ever mindful of the needs of others." She paused, then added, "especially those who aren't here to need anything anymore." When she opened her eyes, the table was just as empty as before. No ghostly hands reached for the bread. No spectral voices filled the silence with chatter and complaint. The only sound was the creak of the house settling and the distant rustle of the pigs. Agnes picked up her spoon and dipped it into the pot of beans she'd set at the center of the table. They were slightly burnt at the bottom. She'd never been much of a cook, a fact her mother had lamented often. But they were hot and filling, which was all that really mattered these days. She ate slowly, methodically, chewing each bite longer than necessary, just to have something to do. Between mouthfuls, she spoke to the empty chairs. "Mary, you'd hate what's become of your herb garden. All that lovely rosemary gone to seed, and the mints taken over everything like a pack of drunken soldiers." She sipped from the blue cup, the cider within still tasting faintly of the apples they'd pressed last autumn, back when there'd been a they to do such things. "Father, you'll be pleased to know I finally fixed that leak in the roof. Took me 3 tries and near got myself killed falling off the ladder, but it's done." The pork was tougher than she remembered, the salt crust making her lips pucker. Still, she made herself eat every bite, washing it down with more cider. "Mother, I found your good sewing needles. They were right where you left them, in that little wooden box under the bed. I've been mending my own clothes with them. You'd laugh to see the stitches, big as a man's and twice as ugly." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she had to stop to clear her throat. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, one of the pigs let out a particularly loud squeal, followed by the sound of something heavy knocking over. Agnes pushed her bowl away and reached for the bread. It was coarse and dry, the grain having been ground too roughly in the abandoned mill, but it was food. She tore off a chunk and set it on Edmund's plate, just as she'd done when they were children and he'd been out working late in the fields. "Remember how you used to say this bread could double as roofing tiles?" She asked the empty space where her brother should have been. "Well, it's gotten worse. Last batch I made, even the pigs turned their noses up at it." The joke fell flat in the empty room. She should stop this foolishness. Should wrap up the uneaten food and save it for tomorrow. Should bank the fire and go to bed like a sensible person. But the thought of lying alone in the dark, listening to the wind and the pigs and the endless creaking of the empty houses, was more than she could bear just yet. Instead, Agnes reached for her father's plate and began cutting the pork into neat slices, just the way he'd liked it. The knife made a satisfying thunk against the wood with each cut. "You'll never guess who came by last week," she said conversationally. "That traveling tinker. The one with the bad teeth who always tried to cheat you on nails. Wanted to buy up the whole village, he did. Offered me 2 silver pennies and a rusty horseshoe for our house." She snorted and shook her head, transferring a slice of meat to her mother's plate. "I told him to piss up a rope, just like you would have. Then I threw a rock at him for good measure." The memory brought a faint smile to her lips. The tinker had yelped like a kicked dog and scurried off down the road, his cart clattering behind him. It had been the most amusement she'd had in months. One by one, she served the imaginary diners, filling each plate with food that would go uneaten, each cup with cider that would never be drunk. It was a waste, she knew, but somehow it felt less wasteful than eating alone. When every plate was full, Agnes sat back and surveyed her handiwork. The table looked almost like it had in the old days, crowded with food and drink and the invisible presence of those who should have been there to share it. She raised her cup. "To family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The fire crackled in response. Agnes drank deeply, then set the cup down with a thump. Enough of this nonsense. The living had needs, even if the dead did not. She reached for her father's plate and began transferring the food back to the central platters, her movements brisk and practical. The bread would keep for tomorrow. The cheese would last a week if wrapped in damp cloth. The pork, carefully rewrapped in its oiled paper, would see her through several meals yet. As she worked, she hummed under her breath. An old lullaby her mother used to sing, though she could only remember every third word or so. The tune was cheerful, or had been once when sung by someone who still remembered how happiness felt. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house like a thing in pain. The pigs had gone quiet, either settled for the night or wandered off to root elsewhere. Somewhere in the village, a loose shutter banged rhythmically against a wall, the sound like a slow, irregular heartbeat. Agnes finished clearing the table and banked the fire for the night. As she climbed the ladder to her sleeping loft, she paused to look back at the empty room below. The dishes sat neatly stacked, the remains of the meal safely stored away. "Good night," she said to no one in particular, and blew out the candle. In the darkness, the house creaked and settled around her, full of ghosts and memories and the faint, lingering scent of a feast that had nourished nothing but her sorrow. Tomorrow would be another day. She would eat the bread, drink the cider, tend to the few animals that remained. She would survive because that was what she'd always done. But tonight, just for a little while, she had not been alone. Chapter 11. The Flagellants Parade. The sound reached Lower Pidlington before the procession did, a rhythmic chanting underscored by the wet slap of leather on flesh, carrying across the fallow fields like some grim agricultural rhythm. Eustace paused while mending a fence post and squinted toward the road where dust rose in a slow, ominous cloud. "Not another damn peddler," he muttered, though the hair on his arm stood upright in primal warning. Joan emerged from their hut with the baby on her hip, her face pinched with the same uneasy curiosity. Agnes appeared from behind the remains of her herb garden, wiping her hands on an already filthy apron. Even Father Cuthbert staggered out from the church, his illness-paled face drawn with apprehension. The first figure crested the hill like a spectre from a fever dream. A gaunt man clad only in tattered breeches, his bare torso crisscrossed with angry red welts. Behind him marched 24 more, men and women alike, their faces obscured by hoods sewn with crude red crosses. At each step, they brought knotted lashes down upon their own backs, the leather strips tipped with metal that glinted dully in the afternoon sun. "Repent!" the lead flagellant bellowed, his voice raw as uncured leather. "The end is nigh, and God's wrath falls upon the wicked." Agnes made a sound halfway between a cough and a scoff. "Oh, splendid! More happy visitors." The procession reached the village square, what remained of it, and formed a rough circle. Their chant rose in pitch and fervor, a discordant chorus of Latin phrases and wordless cries. The rhythmic crack of whips on flesh filled the air, punctuated by occasional groans of ecstatic pain. One woman, her graying hair plastered to her sweating face, collapsed to her knees, only to be yanked upright by her companions, her blood now adding fresh stains to the dusty ground. Father Cuthbert stepped forward, gripping his wooden cross like a shield. "Good people. People," Agnes muttered. "Dib Pable. This is not the way to salvation. Christ bore suffering so that we might—" "Silence, corrupted one." A flagellant with eyes so wide the whites showed all around thrust a trembling finger at the priest. "Your soft words and empty rituals brought this plague upon us. Only blood can wash away sin." To Eustace's horror, several villagers, those few who had survived this long, edged closer to the Flagellants, their faces alight with desperate hope. Widow Cooper fell to her knees before the bleeding woman, hands clasped as if in prayer. "Can you stop it?" the widow begged. "Can your suffering save us?" The flagellant woman pressed a bloody hand to Widow Cooper's forehead, leaving a dark smear. "Join us, sister. Purge your wickedness before the final judgment." Joan grabbed Eustace's arm, her nails digging into his flesh. "Get the baby inside." But it was too late. The lead flagellant's wild gaze had landed on them, and he lurched forward, his whip dangling from one clenched fist. "See how they hoard life while we embrace death." Spittle flew from his cracked lips. "The child lives while better men rot in the ground. What pact have you made with the devil?" A chill ran down Eustace's spine. He stepped between the zealot and his family, hands raised in what he hoped looked like peaceful intent, rather than the defensive stance of a cornered animal. "We made no pacts, just trying to survive. Survival without penance is sin." The flagellant whirled to address his followers. "These half-dead villagers cling to life like rats in the walls, while the world's. Shall we show them the true path?" The answering roar sent the pigs bolting for the woods. What happened next unfolded with nightmarish clarity. The flagellants fell upon their own ranks with renewed fervor, but now their whips lashed outward as well, striking the villagers who dared approach, cracking against door frames and water barrels in indiscriminate fury. A rock flew from somewhere, striking Father Cuthbert in the temple. He went down like a felled tree. Eustace barely registered, grabbing Joan's arm and pulling her toward their hut. Behind them, Agnes was swearing like a soldier as she dragged the dazed priest toward the church. The widow Cooper had joined the flagellant circle, her thin arms already raised to receive the lash. Inside their hut, Eustace barred the door as Joan clutched the wailing baby to her chest. The cacophony outside rose to a fever pitch, chanting, screaming, the relentless crack of leather on flesh, and beneath it all, the steady, ominous thump of feet stamping in rhythm. "Are they dancing?" Joan whispered incredulously. Eustace peered through a crack in the wall. The flagellants had indeed begun a kind of grotesque jig, their wounded backs glistening in the sunlight as they hopped and spun. The widow Cooper stumbled among them, her gray hair now streaked with blood from a self-inflicted scalp wound. "They're mad," Eustace breathed. "Madness looks different when you're hungry," Joan said grimly, rocking the baby. "When you've buried everyone you love. This makes as much sense as mouse liver or powdered unicorn horn." The macabre dance reached its crescendo just as suddenly as it had begun. With a final, ear-splitting cry, the flagellants collapsed, some in deliberate prostration, others from sheer exhaustion. For several minutes the only sounds were ragged breathing and the occasional groan of pain. Then, as if some unseen conductor had given the signal, they rose, helped their wounded brethren to their feet, and reformed their procession. The leader, now sporting a fresh cut above one eye, turned in a slow circle, his gaze passing over the village as if memorizing it for some future reckoning. 3 days, he announced hoarsely. "We return in 3 days to see who among you has embraced salvation. prepare your souls." With that, they marched away, their bloody footprints leaving dark stains in the dust. Behind them, Widow Cooper swayed on her feet, her face alight with eerie bliss as she watched her new mentors depart. Agnes emerged from the church, still supporting the groggy priest. "Well," she observed, surveying the wreckage, overturned buckets, scattered feathers from the Flagellants' costumes, the dark splatters marking their passing. "That was the most exercise anyone's gotten around here in months." Father Cuthbert touched his bleeding temple with shaking fingers. "They'll be back," he murmured. "And next time, they won't just ask for followers." Eustace looked at Joan, at the baby in her arms, then at the fading dust cloud marking the Flagellants' path. Somewhere beyond the fields, the pigs began venturing back into the village, their sensitive noses twitching at the unfamiliar scent of blood on the wind. 3 days. It was both too long and not long enough. He picked up a discarded whip from the dirt, its knots stiff with dried blood, and threw it into the fire. The stink of burning leather filled the air, but Eustace kept watching until the last of it had blackened and curled into ash. There were some remedies even Mother Ethel hadn't dreamed of, and he intended to have them ready when the procession returned. Chapter 12. The Scapegoats. Persecution of the Innocent. The morning after the Flagellants left, Widow Cooper burned her husband's shoes. She did it right in the middle of the village square, piling the leather boots atop a pyre of broken furniture and old thatch. When Eustace asked her why, she turned hollow eyes on him and said, "They were made by a Jew in Norwich. That's where the plague started, you know. Everyone says so." Eustace blinked. "The plague started in the east. Ships from—" "Because of infamy," she hissed, prodding the fire with a stick until the leather curled black. "Poisoning wells, spreading their filth. Flagellants told me. The Flagellants told me." Across the square, Agnes muttered something uncharitable under her breath and stalked off toward her garden. But Eustace saw the way other villagers, those few who remained, edged closer to Widow Cooper's fire, their faces drawn with fear and something darker. It started small. A traveler passing through was chased from the well when someone noticed his accent sounded foreign. Someone else smashed the windows of the abandoned tannery, claiming the Jewish tanner's ghost was breathing sickness into the air. Then Harold, the deaf old farmer, was accused of cursing the crops when he couldn't hear their questions about why his field had fared better than others. Father Cuthbert, still recovering from his head wound, tried to intervene. "This is madness," he croaked, standing unsteadily in the church doorway as a group led by Widow Cooper dragged Harold toward the stocks. "The man can't even hear your accusations, let alone—" "Then why does his barley grow when ours rots?" shouted a man whose name Eustace couldn't recall. One of the newcomers who had drifted in after their own villages died. "Witchcraft, that's why. The stalks hadn't been used in years." The wood groaned ominously as Harold's head and hands were clamped into place, his face slack with confusion. Someone threw a rotten turnip. It missed Harold but splattered against the church wall with a wet smack. Joan pulled Eustace away before he could intervene. "Not our fight," she murmured, though her grip on his arm was painfully tight. "It's everyone's fight when they start." Her glare silenced him. They both knew what happened to those who defended the accused. By evening, Harold had been joined in the stocks by 2 others, a wandering minstrel whose songs brought bad luck, and a girl barely old enough to bleed who was caught drawing strange marks in the dirt. The girl's mother wailed protests until someone pointed out her grandmother had been a midwife known for uncanny knowledge of herbs. Agnes found Eustace sharpening hoe behind his hut. "Going to do some weeding?" she asked dryly, eyeing the gleaming edge. He tested the blade with his thumb. "Just being prepared." She grunted and handed him a small cloth bundle. Inside were 3 prickly balls of dried something that smelled faintly of vinegar and rage. "Throw these in a fire if things get ugly. Makes a smoke that'll clear a room." Eustace pocketed the gifts without asking how Agnes knew how to make such things. Some questions were better left unspoken. The next morning the stocks were empty, except for Harold, who hung limp in his restraints. Whether dead or unconscious, no one checked closely enough to tell before dragging him to the field of the dead. The minstrel had vanished overnight, leaving behind only a broken lute string caught in the splintered wood. The girl was gone too, though her mother now sat rocking by the well, humming tunelessly to no one. Widow Cooper took this as proof of witchcraft rather than the obvious, that sensible people fled persecution when they could. She stalked the village with a makeshift torch, peering into shadows and muttering about, rooting out the wicked. The newcomers followed her like a pack of half-starved dogs hoping for scraps. Eustace watched from his doorway as they paused outside the empty tannery again. This time, someone produced a pot of paint, likely looted from the manor before it was abandoned, and slapped a crude red X across the door. "Mark the houses of corruption," Widow Cooper announced. "So good folk know where the devil lurks." The group moved on, leaving a trail of red X's like bloody fingerprints across the village. They marked the homes of the dead, the fled and the merely odd, with equal fervor. When they reached Eustace's hut, Widow Cooper hesitated. "Your baby never got sick," she accused, her torch sputtering in the damp air. Joan stepped forward, the child balanced on her hip. "Luck," she said flatly. "Or protection," countered a gaunt man Eustace didn't recognize. "My cousin said some folk sacrifice animals too." Agnes materialized from the shadows like a vengeful spirit, her pruning shears glinting in the torchlight. "You'll mark my house next, I suppose, seeing as I know which mushrooms kill and which cure." The group recoiled. Agnes had that effect on people even in good times. Now, with her shorn head and scarred hands, she looked every inch the witch they feared. Widow Cooper opened her mouth, then closed it with a click. Without another word, she turned and led her followers away, leaving Eustace's door unmarked. The red X's glared from the surrounding houses like fresh wounds. That night, Eustace lay awake, listening to distant shouts and the occasional crash of breaking pottery. At some point, the acrid tang of smoke reached them. Someone had set fire to the old mill, though whether as purification or punishment, no one could say. Joan pressed against him, her breath warm on his neck. "We should leave," she whispered. He knew she was right. Knew it with the same certainty. He knew the sun would rise, and the plague would take whom it pleased. But the thought of abandoning the only home he'd ever known stuck in his throat like a fishbone. Outside, a figure darted past their window. One of the accused, perhaps, or just another desperate soul looking for shelter. The pigs stirred in their pen, grunting uneasily as the scent of smoke reached them. Eustace pulled Joan closer. Soon, he lied. Dawn brought no respite. The village stank of charred wood and fear. More houses bore red marks now, and someone had strung up a dead crow over the well. A warning or a ward, depending on who you asked. Father Cuthbert emerged from the church, his robes hastily donned. "This ends today," he announced to no one in particular, then set off toward Widow Cooper's house with the determined stride of a man walking to his own hanging. Eustace gave him 5 minutes before following. Some fights, whether you wanted them or not, came to you eventually. He patted the hoe blade at his belt and the strange smoke balls in his pocket, then stepped out into the madness. Chapter 13. The Lord of the Manor's Empty Hall. The messenger arrived in Lower Pidlington on a horse so thin its ribs stood out like the bars of a cage. His face was grey with exhaustion, his fine livery hanging loose where it had once fit snugly over proud muscles. He reined in at the village square, what remained of it after the recent troubles, and looked around with the dazed expression of a man who couldn't quite believe he'd found living souls. Eustace was the first to approach, his hand resting on the hoe at his belt. "You're from the Manor." The messenger swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a cork in a stormy sea. "Bus," he corrected hoarsely. "I was from the Manor. Now—" He trailed off, staring at the dead crow still dangling over the well. Joan stepped forward, the baby quiet for once in her arms. "What news?" It took 3 tries for the man to get the words out. "Sir Geoffrey is dead, Lady Margaret too. The young Master Thomas lasted until yesterday morning. The steward says—" He paused to cough into a scrap of linen that came away spotted with blood. "The steward says the surviving tenants are to present themselves to swear fealty to the new lord. When one is named—" Agnes barked a laugh that sent the messenger's horse skittering sideways. "Fealty? To whom? The rats in the grain store?" But the messenger wasn't listening. His gaze had fixed on the red X's marking nearby doors, and his already pale face went ashen. Without another word, he wheeled his horse around and kicked it into a stumbling trot back the way he'd come. Father Cuthbert emerged from the church, his face still bruised from the Flagellants' rock. "Well," he said, watching the retreating rider, "that explains why no one came to collect the autumn rents." The news spread through the ravaged village, like fire through dry thatch. By midday, even Widow Cooper had paused her witch-hunting to speculate about who might inherit the estate, now that the main line had died out. "Probably that cousin from Lincolnshire," she announced to anyone who would listen. "The one with the lazy eye and all those daughters. Mark my words, he'll raise the sheep taxes first thing." Eustace said nothing. He was too busy watching the road to the manor, an idea forming in his mind like a storm cloud on the horizon. That evening, after Joan had rocked the baby to sleep, he told her his plan. "We should go to the manor." Joan's hand stilled on the swaddling cloth. "Why, to pay our respects to a dead lord who wouldn't have pissed on us if we were on fire." "Because," Eustace said patiently, "dead lords don't guard their storehouses." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken calculations. Finally, Joan nodded. "We'll need Agnes. And the cart." The manor house stood dark against the moonlit sky, its proud timbers sagging like the ribs of a starving animal. No smoke rose from its chimneys, no torches burned in the courtyard. The only movement came from the wind rustling through the abandoned herb gardens, and the occasional scuttle of something small and furry darting across the flagstones. Agnes surveyed the scene from the cover of the hedgerow. "Well," she whispered, "this is either the smartest thing we've done or the last stupid one." They entered through the kitchen garden, where the gate hung crooked on its hinges. The scent of rotting vegetables mingled with something darker, the unmistakable tang of death that no amount of noble blood could sweeten. Inside, the great hall stretched before them, its long table still set with the remnants of what must have been the household's last meal. Plates of moldering food sat untouched, cups of wine gone thick and sour. At the high table, a single chair lay toppled over, as if its occupant had risen suddenly and never returned. Joan crossed herself. "God, have mercy." Agnes was already moving, her sharp eyes scanning the shadowed corners for anything useful. "God's busy. Let's see to ourselves." They found the storerooms untouched. Barrels of grain, sacks of flour, wheels of cheese carefully waxed for preservation, all waiting for masters who would never return to claim them. Eustace pried open a cask of apples and inhaled the crisp scent of autumn before the rot set in. "It's enough to last the winter," he murmured, running his hands over the stacked provisions. "Enough for everyone left." Joan was already filling their cart with the most portable items: sacks of dried beans, jars of honey, a ham wrapped in muslin. Her movements were quick and efficient, but her eyes kept darting toward the darkened corridors beyond the storeroom. Agnes emerged from the pantry with an armful of spices and a grin. "Found the good saffron. Worth its weight in gold, this is." She paused, sniffing the air. "Do you smell that?" Eustace did. Beneath the layers of dust and decay, there was something else, the faint but unmistakable metallic tang of fresh blood. They followed the scent to the solar, where the family's private chambers lay. The door stood slightly ajar, a thin sliver of moonlight cutting across the floorboards inside. Joan grabbed Eustace's arm. "We don't need to go in there." But something compelled him forward. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges protesting with a high-pitched whine. Lady Margaret lay on the bed, her once fine gown now stained dark around the neck and sleeves. At her feet, curled like a loyal hound, was young Thomas, barely 12 years old. And now, as still as the stone effigies in the church, it was the scene by the window that stopped Eustace's breath in his throat. Sir Geoffrey sat slumped in a chair, his sword protruding from his chest at an awkward angle. His hand still gripped the hilt, the fingers white-knuckled even in death. "Sweet Christ," Agnes breathed behind him. The lord of the manor had not waited for the plague to take him. Joan pulled them back into the corridor, her face pale but set. "Enough," she said firmly. "We take what we came for and go. Let the dead keep their secrets." They worked quickly after that, loading the cart with as much as it could hold without breaking. As they passed through the courtyard one last time, Eustace noticed the family chapel, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the votive candles had long since burned out, but a single silver chalice still stood on the altar, catching the moonlight like a beacon. Father Cuthbert would want that, he thought, for when the survivors needed blessings more than bread. The ride back to the village was silent, but for the creak of the cart and the occasional hoot of an owl. The manor dwindled behind them, its empty windows watching like sightless eyes. As they neared Lower Pidlington, a figure emerged from the shadows, Widow Cooper, her face gaunt in the pre-dawn light. She took in the loaded cart with wide eyes, then turned her gaze to the distant silhouette of the manor. "So it's true," she whispered. "All of them gone." Eustace braced for accusations, for demands, for some fresh madness born of grief and fear. Instead, the widow reached into the cart and took a single apple. She polished it on her sleeve, then took a slow, deliberate bite. The crunch seemed obscenely loud in the stillness. "We'll need more carts," she said at last, wiping juice from her chin. "And shovels, lots of shovels." And just like that, the last lord of Lower Pidlington passed from living memory. His halls left to the mice and the ghosts, his lands waiting for new hands to work them. Eustace looked at Joan, at the sleeping baby in her arms, then at the road ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight at least they would eat. Chapter 14. The children left behind. The first sign that something was amiss came when old Simon's pigs began disappearing. Not all at once, but one by one, vanishing from their pen with no tracks or signs of struggle. At first Eustace suspected wolves, but when he set traps he found them empty and unspoiled each morning. Then the apples started going missing from the storehouse. Not the obvious ones on top, but carefully selected from the middle of the barrel, as if someone was trying to hide their theft. It was Joan who finally spotted them. She'd gone to the old mill to scavenge what remained of the flour stores, and found a small grimy handprint on the doorframe. Following a trail of scattered oat husks, she discovered the children hiding in the rafters like a family of startled owls. There were 5 of them in all. Tom, the miller's boy, now nearly 13 and trying desperately to look like he wasn't terrified. His sister Meg, who couldn't have been more than 8. The twins from the weaver's cottage, Dickon and Mab, still wearing matching threadbare tunics, though Mab had torn hers on one side to tell them apart. And little Colin, the tanner's grandson, who clung to Tom's leg like a burr and hadn't spoken a word since his grandfather died. They stared down at Joan with wide, wary eyes, their faces smeared with dirt and old tears. "We weren't stealing," Tom said quickly, though the half-eaten apple in his hand suggested otherwise. "Just borrowing. We meant to put it back." Joan looked at the filthy, hollow-cheeked children, and did the only sensible thing. She held out her hand and said, "Come have proper supper." The children's camp, as it turned out, was in the old smokehouse behind the mill. They dragged in straw for bedding, built a small fire pit in the center, with truly alarming disregard for the flammability of their surroundings, and lined the walls with whatever treasures they'd scavenged: a chipped bowl, a bent spoon, a rag doll, missing most of its stuff. Agnes took one look at their setup and snorted. "You'll all die of smoke inhalation before the plague gets you." Eustace said nothing, just began portioning out stew from the pot Joan had brought. The children fell on the food like wolves, barely pausing to breathe between bites. Little Colin, still silent, held his bowl out for thirds with trembling hands. "How long have you been on your own?" Joan asked gently. Tom wiped his mouth on his sleeve. "Since the Flagellants came. They said our parents died in sin, so we couldn't stay in our houses." His jaw set in a way that made him look far older than his years. "We've been doing fine." This was clearly a lie. The children were filthy, thin as reeds, and Dickon had developed a worrying cough that echoed in his narrow chest. But Eustace recognized the stubborn pride in Tom's voice and didn't challenge it. "You have," he agreed. "But you'll do better with help." They moved the children into Agnes's house, not because it was the largest, but because it was the farthest from Widow Cooper and her growing band of zealots. Agnes grumbled about the noise and mess, but Eustace noticed she'd already mended Mab's torn tunic and set Dickon to stirring her potions under strict supervision. The village, what remained of it, reacted to the children's reappearance in varied ways. Father Cuthbert blessed them and immediately set Tom to work digging graves, a grim but necessary job. Widow Cooper eyed them suspiciously, no doubt wondering which might be which's spawn. The pigs, now minus several of their number, regarded the children with what could only be described as reproachful snuffling. It was little Colin who broke first. He woke screaming one night, his small body drenched in sweat, crying for a grandfather who would never answer. Joan rocked him by the fire, humming lullabies while the other children pretended not to watch from their pallets. "He doesn't talk anymore," Meg whispered to Eustace. "Not since they burned his granda's books." Eustace felt a cold anger settle in his chest. The tanner had been a learned man, one of the few in the village who could read. His collection of herbal remedies and histories had been deemed unnatural by the Flagellants. The next morning he found Tom trying to teach Dickon to set snares in the woods. The boy's hands shook as he tied the knots, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You're doing it wrong," Eustace said gently, showing him the proper way. "Like this." Tom watched carefully, then mimicked the motion. "Why are you helping us?" Eustace considered lying, but the boy deserved better. "Because someone helped me when I was your age, and because the world's hard enough without leaving children to fend for themselves." Tom nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. "I can work," he said. "So can Meg. The twins are useless, but they'll learn." They did learn. Slowly, painfully, the children began to adapt. Mab revealed a knack for finding edible plants in the woods. Dickon, despite his cough, could carry water buckets without spilling a drop. Even little Colin started helping by gathering eggs from the few remaining chickens, his small hands surprisingly gentle. The village changed around them too. The presence of children, dirty, grieving but alive, seemed to remind the adults that there might possibly be a future worth preparing for. Widow Cooper stopped painting red X's on doors and started knitting mismatched socks for the twins. The newcomers, who had been so quick to accuse, began teaching the children useful skills. How to mend nets, how to tell weather by the clouds, how to cheat at dice. Though Father Cuthbert put a stop to that last one. One evening, as Eustace returned from checking the traps, he found Joan sitting outside with the baby in her lap and little Colin curled against her side. The boy was speaking for the first time in weeks, whispering a story about his grandfather's book of saints. "And St. Christopher carried the Christ child across the river," Colin murmured, his small fingers tracing patterns in the dirt, even though he didn't know it was him at first. Joan caught Eustace's eye and smiled. It was a small thing, that smile, but it held more hope than he'd seen in months. Inside the house, the other children squabbled over supper while Agnes threatened to turn them all into toads if they didn't behave. Outside, the first stars blinked awake in a sky that no longer felt quite so empty. The plague wasn't gone. The world wasn't healed. But in that moment, with a child's quiet voice weaving tales of unlikely salvation, it almost felt like it might be. Chapter 15. The Ghost Town. The first thing you noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful hush of a winter morning or the drowsy quiet of a summer afternoon, but a thick, smothering stillness that settled over Lower Pidlington like a shroud. The birds still sang in the woods beyond the fields, but they avoided the village itself, as if sensing something human ears could not. Eustace walked the empty lanes at dawn, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the absence of other sounds. The weeds had begun their conquest in earnest, nettles and ivy creeping across thresholds, tendrils of bindweed winding through broken shutters, dandelions cracking the hard-packed earth of the common ground. Nature was reclaiming what had been taken from it, one stubborn green finger at a time. The houses stood like sentinels guarding memories rather than people. Some doors hung open, revealing glimpses of interrupted lives, a stool overturned near a cold hearth, a child's wooden doll abandoned mid-play, a pot left to scorch over ashes that had not been stirred in months. Others were sealed tight, their occupants having fled or died within, the wood around the frames darkened by the smoke of prevention fires that had not, in the end, prevented anything. The forge was a carcass of its former self. The blacksmith's tools still lay where he had dropped them the day he walked away, rust creeping over hammerheads and tongs like some slow, patient blight. A pair of crows had built a nest in the bellows, their beady eyes watching Eustace with detached curiosity as he passed. The mill fared no better. Its great wheel had jammed months ago, and the stream now diverted around it with the indifference of water to human industry. The sacks of grain left inside had sprouted strange, pale shoots in the dark, seeking sunlight that could not reach them. Mice had chewed through the corners, their tiny footprints tracing chaotic paths across the flour-dusted floor. Even the church, God's supposed stronghold against despair, had not been spared. The thatch was peeling back in places, admitting shafts of sunlight that illuminated drifting motes of dust where incense and prayer had once mingled. The altar cloth, once pristine white, was now gray with neglect, and someone had stolen the silver candlesticks, leaving behind only faint circular stains where their bases had rested. Father Cuthbert still held Mass there every Sunday, but his congregation had dwindled to a handful of souls. The echoes of his sermons bounced off the walls and came back to him hollow. The fields told their own grim story. The wheat that had not been harvested lay flattened by winter rains, tangled with chickweed and thistle. The Lord's orchard sagged under the weight of unpicked fruit, branches bowing low like mourners at a graveside. Here and there a stubborn row of beans or cabbages survived where some determined soul had tended them, but most plots had surrendered to the wilderness. The animals that remained had grown bold in the absence of human competition. Old Simon's pigs had multiplied and gone semi-feral, their rotund forms rooting through abandoned gardens with impunity. The village dogs had formed a ragged pack that slinked along the edges of things, neither fully wild nor tame anymore. Even the cats, those that survived, had taken on a lean, furtive look, their eyes reflecting firelight a little too brightly at night. The well at the center of the village still functioned, though the dead crow no longer dangled above it. Someone, probably Agnes, had cut it down and thrown it in the field of the dead, where it joined the other unquiet things. The water that rose from the depths was as cold and clear as ever, utterly indifferent to the fact that so few came to drink from it now. At the edge of the village, where the path wound its way toward the woods and the world beyond, a single wild rose had taken root in the ditch. No one had planted it. No one tended it. Yet it bloomed with violent pink fervor, its thorns catching at the cloaks of the rare traveler who passed by as if to say, "Stay, something beautiful still grows here." Eustace paused by the rose one evening on his way back from checking the traps. He touched one of the blossoms, half expecting it to crumble to dust like everything else seemed to be doing. But it held firm, its petals soft and vibrant against his work-roughened fingers. Behind him, in the gathering twilight, the first lights of the surviving households winked on, Joan lighting the tallow candles in their hut, Agnes stirring a pot of something pungent over her fire, Father Cuthbert's solitary lamp burning in the church as he prepared for another evening of praying to a God who felt increasingly distant. The village was dying. This much was obvious. But as Eustace turned his back on the wild rose and walked toward those few remaining lights, he thought perhaps it wasn't dead yet. Not quite. Chapter 16. The Few Who Remain. By the time winter's grip loosened, Lower Pidlington had become a village of eccentrics. Agnes took to wearing 3 hats at once: a woolen cap, a straw sun hat, and what appeared to be the better part of a rust-colored cowl she'd scavenged from the abandoned nunnery 2 valleys over. When asked about this sartorial choice, she merely tapped the side of her nose and said, layering, as if this explained everything. Father Cuthbert had developed the peculiar habit of conducting Mass while standing on one leg. Penitential practice, he claimed, though Eustace suspected it had more to do with the priest's wager with himself, about how long he could balance before his bad knee gave out. Last Sunday he'd made it through the Lord's Prayer and half of the Nicene Creed before toppling into the baptismal font. Widow Cooper, having exhausted the village's supply of alleged witches to persecute, had turned her attention to more domestic threats. She could often be seen patrolling the edges of her garden with a sharpened hoe, muttering dire warnings at the rabbits who dared nibble her struggling pea shoots. "I know you're kind," she'd hiss at their twitching noses. Soft fur and devil's eyes. The children had developed their own peculiar survival strategies. Tom, now the self-appointed leader of their ragtag band, carried a dried pig's bladder filled with some mysterious liquid that he claimed warded off evil spirits. Mab had started collecting teeth, animal teeth mostly, though Eustace tried not to examine her finds too closely. Little Colin still didn't speak, but he'd begun leaving careful arrangements of stones and feathers outside each dwelling every morning, as if building tiny monuments to their continued existence. Even the animals had gone strange. Old Simon's prize sow, now the matriarch of a considerable pig dynasty, had developed an unsettling habit of watching the survivors with an intelligence that bordered on judgmental. The village dogs no longer barked, but communicated through an elaborate system of sighs and meaningful glances. And the miller's cat, once a fat and lazy creature, had transformed into a gaunt, golden-eyed phantom that brought gifts of half-eaten voles to anyone foolish enough to show it kindness. Eustace found Joan standing in their doorway one morning, staring at the pig with narrowed eyes. "She's planning something," Joan muttered. "I can tell by the way she looks at the baby." The pig. The pig. Sure enough, when Eustace checked the sty that evening, he found the sow had somehow dismantled the gate's latch and was in the process of teaching her piglets to do the same. He repaired it with extra nails, but couldn't shake the feeling the animals were watching him learn. The village's meals had taken on a surreal quality as well. With most crops failed or forgotten, they'd entered what Agnes cheerfully referred to as the whatever doesn't kill us phase of culinary experimentation. Dinners might consist of roasted hedgehog, surprisingly palatable if you didn't think about it too much, stewed nettles, veso, and an increasingly creative array of mushroom concoctions that sometimes led to vivid hallucinations and always led to heated debates about whose turn it was to gather firewood the next morning. Father Cuthbert blessed these meals with increasing desperation, his Latin stumbling over words like lichen and questionable tubers. Even their attempts at normalcy had gone slightly off-kilter. When Widow Cooper suggested they revive the tradition of May Day dancing, the resulting spectacle involved Agnes attempting to lead the pig in a jig, Tom playing a reed flute wildly off-key, and Father Cuthbert confusing the fertility rites with the Stations of the Cross. They'd all agreed it was the best May Day celebration in recent memory, though no one could quite remember why. The children, at least, seemed to be thriving in this strange new world. Meg had taken over the care of the few remaining chickens, carrying them around like fuzzy, clucking babies. The twins had built an elaborate fortress out of broken furniture and old thatch, from which they launched increasingly ambitious raids on Agnes's herb garden. And little Colin, still silent, had developed an uncanny ability to find lost things, a dropped needle in the rushes, a missing spoon, Eustace's favorite whetstone that had vanished months ago. It was during one of their increasingly bizarre communal meals, this one featuring a suspiciously large hare that no one wanted to question too closely, that Agnes made an announcement. "I'm going to teach the children to read." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Widow Cooper choking on her ale. "The devil's work," the widow finally managed to gasp. "Better than your work," Agnes shot back. "Unless you'd prefer the next generation to grow up thinking X's on doors count as literature." Father Cuthbert, perhaps sensing another religious schism brewing, hastily interjected. "I could help. There's still a psalter in the church, mostly intact." And so it was decided. Every afternoon, when the light was best, the children would gather in Agnes's hut, now more library than dwelling, its walls lined with scavenged books and fragments of parchment, to puzzle out letters and form clumsy words. Even little Colin joined in, tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick, his small face screwed up in concentration. It wasn't much. It wasn't normal. But as Eustace watched Joan rock their baby to sleep that night, the pig lurking just outside the door with her usual air of porcine intrigue, he thought perhaps it was enough. The world had ended, and yet here they were, the few, the strange, the stubborn, still eating questionable stew, and mending leaky roofs and teaching children their letters by firelight. Outside, the first frogs of spring began their evening chorus, their voices rising from the reeds like an off-key hymn to survival. Chapter 17. The Plague Doctor's Useless Visit. The plague doctor arrived on a Thursday, though no one in Lower Pidlington particularly cared what day it was anymore. He came clanking down the overgrown lane, like some misplaced suit of armor, his beaked mask giving him the appearance of an enormous malformed crow that had forgotten how to fly. His long leather coat smelled strongly of vinegar and something more pungent, likely the protective herbs stuffed into the beak's hollow tip. Agnes took one look at him from her doorway and muttered, "Oh good, another idiot." The doctor, if indeed he was a doctor, and not just some enterprising fool who'd stolen the costume, paused in what remained of the village square and raised his gloved hands in what might have been intended as a benediction. "Good people," his voice echoed strangely from inside the mask. "I bring salvation from the pestilence." Eustace exchanged glances with Joan. The baby, fascinated by the strange figure, reached chubby hands toward the beak and gurgled. Father Cuthbert, ever the diplomat, stepped forward. "Good doctor, we've had many such offers of—" "Stand aside, man of God," the doctor intoned, producing a wooden wand from somewhere within his voluminous robes. "Science comes to save your wretched souls." The wand, it turned out, was for poking suspected plague victims. The doctor began his examination by walking up to Widow Cooper and jabbing her sharply in the ribs with it. "Ow, you daft buzzard!" "Ah," the doctor said sagely, "the patient exhibits signs of irritability, a common precursor to the disease." Widow Cooper responded by jabbing him back with her garden hoe. Undeterred, the plague doctor moved through the village like a particularly inept spectre of death. He diagnosed Tom with excess phlegm. After the boy sneezed, it was pollen season. He declared Mab's collection of teeth a clear sign of demonic influence. He spent an alarming amount of time staring at the pigs, before concluding they were unnaturally intelligent and probably in league with Satan. His treatments were, if possible, even more absurd than his diagnoses. For Agnes's arthritis, he prescribed a poultice made of crushed earthworms and eggshells. For Father Cuthbert's bad knee, he recommended hanging upside down from the church rafters for no less than 3 hours daily. When Joan asked, purely out of morbid curiosity, what one might do to prevent the plague, he produced a small vial of murky liquid. "Tincture of powdered emerald and dried toad," he announced proudly. "Extremely expensive." I can let you have it for... He paused to consult a small notebook. 3 chickens, a bushel of wheat, or your firstborn child. Joan considered this. Would you take the pig instead? The plague doctor drew himself up to his full, ridiculous height. Madam, I am a man of science, not a livestock trader. Shame, Joan said. She's been giving me the evil eye all week. By afternoon, the doctor had moved on to his pièce de résistance, the famous plague doctor's mask itself. He gathered the villagers, those who hadn't fled at his approach, and gave a lengthy lecture on its protective qualities. The herbs in the beak purify the air, he explained, tapping the grotesque protrusion. The glass eyepieces ward off miasmas. The leather repels evil humors. Agnes squinted at the mask. Looks like it repels common sense, too. The doctor chose to ignore this. Instead, he produced a small bell from his robes and began ringing it while walking in slow circles. The sound disrupts the pestilential vapors, he announced over the clanging. The pigs, who had been observing these proceedings with their usual air of porcine disdain, chose this moment to stage their revolt. Whether offended by the bell, the doctor's smell, or simply bored, the largest sow charged. What followed was less a medical intervention and more a farcical ballet. The doctor ran. The pig pursued. The children cheered. At some point, the beaked mask went flying, revealing its wearer to be a spotty youth who couldn't have been more than 18. Come back! Tom yelled as the would-be healer disappeared down the road, his expensive coat flapping behind him. You forgot your science wand. The mask remained where it had fallen, gazing up at the sky with empty eye-holes. Agnes poked it with her foot. Well, anyone want to try their luck? No one did. That evening, as they gathered around the fire, the mask took up residence on a shelf next to Agnes's collection of questionable remedies. The children had taken turns wearing it earlier, staging mock diagnoses of each other. You, sir, suffer from an acute case of being a twit. But now it just sat there, its beak casting an ominous shadow on the wall. You know, Father Cuthbert mused, I think that might be the first time our pigs have actually been useful. Joan nodded, bouncing the baby on her knee. We should put them in charge of screening visitors. Eustace said nothing, just stirred the stew and watched the flames. The world was full of fools, some in beaked masks, some in priest robes, some in nothing but their own stubborn certainty. Outside, the pigs grumbled to each other in the darkness, no doubt plotting their next move. The moon rose over the silent fields, illuminating the empty lanes and abandoned homes. Somewhere, perhaps, the plague doctor was still running, and in Lower Pidlington, against all odds, life went on. Chapter 18. The first signs of recovery. The first sign came from an unlikely source, the pigs. For weeks, old Simon's ever-multiplying herd had been rooting through the abandoned gardens and fallow fields, their pink snouts churning up soil with single-minded determination. Then one morning, Eustace noticed something peculiar. The sows had begun separating themselves from the group, carrying mouthfuls of straw to quiet corners behind sheds and under hedgerows. They're nesting, Joan observed, bouncing the baby on her hip as they watched a particularly large sow waddle past with an entire armful of thatch. Agnes squinted at the expectant mothers. Means they think they'll live long enough to see piglets weaned. The realization settled over them like a warm cloak. The animals, those stubborn barometers of survival, sensed the danger was passing. Other signs followed in quick succession. The weeds that had overtaken Widow Cooper's garden suddenly revealed themselves to be not just weeds, but an enthusiastic crop of volunteer cabbages and onions from last year's seeds. The village well, which had tasted faintly of despair all winter, now produced water so cold and clear it made their teeth ache. Even the weather seemed to be in on the conspiracy. The sun rose each morning with renewed enthusiasm, warming the stones of the abandoned houses until they radiated heat like bread fresh from the oven. Gentle rains came at night, soaking into the thirsty earth without washing away what few crops they'd managed to plant. Father Cuthbert was the first to say it aloud. Standing in the doorway of the church one unusually warm morning, watching the children chase butterflies through the overgrown common, he removed his hat and said simply, "I think it's over." No one cheered. No one wept. They'd all learned better than to tempt fate with grand pronouncements. But that night, Eustace noticed Joan didn't check the baby for fever before putting her to sleep. And when Agnes handed out portions of stew, she didn't immediately set aside for the sick like she'd done every meal for months. The village began emerging from its long hibernation with the cautious optimism of creatures, unsure if winter had truly passed. Doors that had been sealed tight against miasmas and misfortune now stood open to admit the spring air. The few remaining chickens, having survived on a combination of luck and the children's devotion, began laying eggs with such enthusiasm it seemed they were making up for lost time. Even Widow Cooper softened. She was spotted one morning actually speaking to the rabbits in her garden rather than threatening them. "You can have the outer leaves," she told a particularly bold buck, "but leave the hearts be." The rabbit, perhaps sensing this was as close to a peace treaty as it would get, obliged. The fields presented their own small miracles. Where they'd managed to sow, green shoots pushed through the rich soil with almost indecent vigor. The wheat, though patchy, stood straight and tall. The bean vines climbed their poles with the determination of sailors scaling rigging. Of course, not everything returned to normal. The mill wheel still sat motionless, its mechanism rusted beyond repair. The forge remained cold, its anvil gathering dust. Whole lanes of houses stood empty, their thatch slowly surrendering to moss and ivy. But life, in its stubborn way, persisted. One evening, as the sun set behind the church, Eustace found Joan standing in their doorway, with the baby asleep against her shoulder. She was watching Tom teach little Colin how to whittle, the boy's small hands carefully copying each motion while the older children looked on. "You know," Joan said quietly, "we'll need to tell them about the world before, what it was like." Eustace nodded, watching as Mab triumphantly presented a lopsided wooden spoon she'd carved. The children's laughter floated across the common, mingling with the chirp of crickets and the distant grumbling of contented pigs. "Not yet," he said, taking Joan's hand. "Let them have this first." And so the days passed, each one a little brighter than the last. The baby took her first stumbling steps. The first strawberries ripened in Agnes's garden. Father Cuthbert stopped standing on one leg during Mass, though his knee still protested at rain. No grand pronouncements were made. No bells were rung. But slowly, quietly, Lower Pidlington remembered how to hope. The plague had taken much, but as the first fireflies of summer blinked to life above the fields, even the ghosts seemed to sigh and settle. The worst was over. Now came the living. Chapter 19. The Survivor's Bargain. The new lord arrived on a horse that cost more than the entire village had produced in taxes last year. Sir Richard of somewhere important was everything his predecessor had not been. Young, ambitious, and acutely aware that he now owned vast tracts of land with almost no one left to work them. He surveyed Lower Pidlington from atop his gleaming stallion, his nose wrinkling at the lingering scent of pigs and unwashed humanity. Eustace watched from the shadow of his doorway as the nobleman's retinue, a harried clerk, 2 bored-looking guards, and a boy who seemed mostly there to hold things, dismounted in what passed for the village square. "Christ's bones," Sir Richard muttered, eyeing the overgrown lanes and sagging roofs. "It looks like the devil's back garden." Agnes, who had been pretending to weed her herb garden while observing the newcomers, straightened with a grunt. "Welcome to paradise, my lord. Mind the pig shit." The negotiations began that afternoon in the church, the only building still intact enough to impress visitors. Sir Richard sat in the front pew, his fine cloak draped carefully to avoid contact with the wood. Arrayed before him stood the remaining villagers, Eustace and Joan, Agnes, Widow Cooper, Father Cuthbert, and surprisingly Tom, who at 13 was now the closest thing they had to a representative of Lower Pidlington's youth. The pigs, sensing important business afoot, had stationed themselves just outside the door. Sir Richard cleared his throat. As you know, the late Sir Geoffrey's line has ended. He paused delicately, as if the plague was some embarrassing family scandal rather than an act of God. The Crown has seen fit to grant me these lands, and I intend to make them productive again. Widow Cooper bobbed an awkward curtsy. God save the king, my lord, and you as well. Yes, yes. Sir Richard waved a hand. The point is, I need tenants. You need land. We should be able to come to some arrangement. The clerk unrolled a parchment and began reading terms in a nasal monotone. The villagers would work the Lord's demesne 3 days a week, as always. They would pay their customary tithes. They would. Agnes coughed loudly. Sir Richard raised an eyebrow. Yes? We'll want more, Eustace said simply. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Widow Cooper gasping like a landed fish. Sir Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. More what, exactly? More everything, Joan said, bouncing the baby on her hip. More days for ourselves. More of what we grow. More say in how things are done. Tom, emboldened, added, and wages for extra work. Not just food. Sir Richard's fingers tightened around the hilt of his dagger. You presume much, for peasants who should be grateful to have survived at all. Father Cuthbert chose this moment to intervene. My lord, with respect, there are perhaps 1/4 the number of able hands as before the pestilence. Those who remain can hardly be expected to work themselves to death, rebuilding what was lost without incentive. Incentive. The word hung in the air like the last note of a funeral bell. Sir Richard studied them all with the calculating gaze of a man who just realized the scales had tipped in an unexpected direction. He turned to his clerk. What are they getting at other manors? The clerk consulted his notes. Some lords are offering 2 days' labor owed instead of 3, 1/3 of harvests rather than half. In Essex, they're finet autum dedane. Sir Richard cut him off with a sharp gesture. 2 days' labor owed weekly. You keep 3/5 of what you grow. And if I require extra hands for harvest or planting, I'll pay a penny a day. The villagers exchanged glances. It was more than they dared hope for. Agnes, however, wasn't finished. And the empty cottages go to whoever works them back to productivity. No extra fees. And Joan added quickly, no taking our children for servants unless they agree to it. Sir Richard looked like he'd bitten into an unripe persimmon. You drive a hard bargain for people 1 bad harvest away from starvation. Eustace met his gaze evenly. We've already survived the end of the world, my lord. Starvation seems a small thing after that. Perhaps it was the quiet certainty in his voice. Perhaps Sir Richard simply wanted to be done with these inconvenient survivors. Whatever the reason, the new lord of the manor surprised them all by throwing back his head and laughing. Christ's teeth, I like you people. Very well. The terms are agreed. He gestured to his clerk. Draw up the contracts. As the clerk scribbled furiously, Sir Richard leaned forward, his eyes alight with something that might have been respect. Just don't make me regret this. The next plague might not be so selective. Outside, the pigs grunted their approval as the villagers emerged into the sunlight, blinking like miners coming up from the depths. Tom immediately began telling the other children about their victory, embellishing his own role in the negotiations with each retelling. Agnes spat in the dirt. We should have asked for more. Joan adjusted the baby on her hip. We got more than our fathers ever dreamed of. Eustace looked around at the battered but unbowed faces of his neighbors, the stubborn, strange survivors who had somehow outlasted death itself. The field stretched before them, ripe with possibility. The empty cottages waited for new hands to bring them back to life. For the first time in living memory, the future belonged to them as much as to any lord. That night, they celebrated with the last of the Manor's abandoned wine, and a haunch of venison Sir Richard had generously allowed them to poach from his forests. The children danced to Tom's off-key flute playing. The pigs gorged themselves on scraps. Even Widow Cooper smiled, though it looked like it pained her. As the fire burned low, Joan leaned against Eustace, her breath warm against his neck. "Do you think it'll last?" Eustace watched the embers rise into the starry sky, each one a tiny beacon against the darkness. "Nothing lasts forever, but for now, it's enough." And for once it was. Chapter 20. A New Normal. The first wedding in Lower Pidlington after the plague was between two people who had never imagined marrying each other before the dying began. Edith, the blacksmith's widowed daughter, stood in the church wearing a dress made from what had once been her mother's best tablecloth. Her groom was Martin, the shy shepherd who'd survived by driving his flock deep into the woods and living like a hermit for a year. They held hands awkwardly as Father Cuthbert pronounced them man and wife, both looking faintly surprised at their own daring. The feast that followed was a strange, wonderful affair. The tables groaned under dishes made from the first proper harvest in years, plump bread loaves, roasted vegetables, even a haunch of venison that Sir Richard had mysteriously failed to notice, missing from his forests. The children, now too numerous to count properly, ran wild through the lanes, their laughter bouncing off walls that had echoed with silence for so long. Eustace watched from the edge of the celebration, Joan leaning against him with their now toddler asleep in her arms. Around them, the village pulsed with life. New faces mingling with old survivors, strangers who had come seeking opportunity in a half-empty world. Wow, I was hungry. Oh, wow. "It's not the same," Joan murmured, nodding toward where a family of newcomers was dancing with abandon to Tom's increasingly drunken flute playing. "No," Eustace agreed, "but it's something." And it was. The forge had reopened under Edith's rough but capable hands, though she did more mending than making these days. The fields, while still patchwork, yielded enough to keep bellies full with something left over to sell. Even the pigs had settled into a kind of truce with humanity, content to root at the edges of things rather than through the heart of them. Agnes, now the undisputed elder of the village despite being barely 50, held court by the cider barrel. She'd taken to wearing her 3 hats stacked differently each day, a sartorial rebellion that the newcomers found baffling, and the old survivors understood perfectly. "Mark my words," she was telling a group of wide-eyed children. "This lot will be calling it the Good Death within a generation." She gestured at the laughing, dancing crowd. "They'll forget how the field stank with burning corpses, how the silence could choke you." Little Colin, who had finally started speaking in short, careful sentences, tugged at her sleeve. "But we won't forget." Agnes patted his head with unusual gentleness. "No, lad, we won't." As dusk fell, the celebration spilled out into the lanes. Someone had brought a fiddle, and its lively strains mingled with the chirp of crickets and the distant hoot of owls. The scent of wood smoke and roasted meat hung heavy in the air, covering, if only for a night, the lingering traces of old sorrow. Eustace and Joan walked home slowly, their sleeping child heavy in Joan's arms. Around them, the village glowed with candlelight from windows that had been dark for so long. Here and there, a house still stood empty, its thatch sagging and its garden wild. But more often now, lanterns burned and voices murmured behind closed doors. Inside their hut, Joan settled the toddler into bed while Eustace banked the fire. The familiar routine felt different tonight, not like before the plague, but not like during it either. Some new rhythm they were still learning. "Did you see Martin's face when Edith kissed him?" Joan asked, unpinning her hair. "I thought he might faint." Eustace chuckled. "Looked like a man who'd won a prize he didn't know he wanted." They lay together in the dark, listening to the distant sounds of the wedding still going strong. Somewhere, a dog barked. The pigs grumbled in their pen. The wind rustled through the barley fields, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow's work. Joan's hand found Eustace's in the darkness. "We made it," she whispered. He squeezed her fingers, thinking of all they'd lost and all they'd somehow managed to keep. Outside, the first stars of evening blinked awake, their cold light shining down on graves and gardens alike. "Yes," he said at last. "We did." And if his voice broke a little on the words, well, that was just the smoke from the fire. Somewhere in the village, a baby cried. A door creaked open. A laugh rang out, clear and bright against the night. Life went on.